Don Quixote, Volume 1, by Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra, translated by John Ormsby. Chapter 34-35. Chapter 34, in which is continued the novel of The Ill-Advised Curiosity. It is commonly said that an army looks ill without its general, and a castle without its castellan, and I say that a young married woman looks still worse without her husband, unless there are very good reasons for it. I find myself so ill at ease without you, and so incapable of enduring the separation, that unless you return quickly I shall have to go for relief to my parents' house, even if I leave yours without a protector. For the one you left me, if indeed he deserves that title, has, I think, more regard for his own pleasure than to what concerns you. As you are possessed of discernment, I need say no more to you, nor indeed is it fitting I should say more. Anselmo received his letter, and from it he gathered that Lothario had already begun his task, and that Camilla must have replied to him as he would have wished. And delighted beyond measure at such intelligence, he sent word to her not to leave his house on any account, as he would return very shortly. Camilla was astonished at Anselmo's reply, which placed her in greater perplexity than before, for she never dared to remain in her own house, nor yet to go to her parents', for in remaining her virtue was imperilled, and in going she was opposed to her husband's commands. Finally she decided upon what was the worst course for her, to remain, resolving not to fly from the presence of Lothario, that she might not give food for gossip to her servants, and she now began to regret having written as she had to her husband, fearing he might imagine that Lothario had perceived some lightness which had impelled him to lay aside the respect he owed her. But confident of her rectitude, she put her trust in God and in her own virtuous intentions, with which she hoped to resist in silence all the solicitations of Lothario, without saying anything to her husband so as not to involve him in any quarrel or trouble. And she began to consider how to excuse Lothario to Anselmo when he should ask her what it was that induced her to write that letter. With these resolutions, more honourable than judicious or effectual, she remained the next day listening to Lothario, who pressed his suit so strenuously that Camilla's firmness began to waver, and their virtue had enough to do to come to the rescue of her eyes and keep them from showing signs of a certain tender compassion which the tears and appeals of Lothario had awakened in her bosom. Lothario observed all this, and it inflamed him all the more. In short, he felt that while Anselmo's absence afforded time and opportunity, he must press the siege of the fortress, and so he assailed her self-esteem with praises of her beauty, for there is nothing that more quickly reduces and levels the castle towers of fair woman's vanity than vanity itself upon the tongue of flattery. In fact, with the utmost assiduity, he undermined the rock of her purity with such engines that had Camilla been a brass she must have fallen. He wept, he entreated, he promised, he flattered, he importuned, he pretended with so much feeling and apparent sincerity that he overthrew the virtuous resolves of Camilla, and won the triumph he least expected and most longed for. Camilla yielded, Camilla fell, but what wonder if the friendship of Lothario could not stand firm? A clear proof to us that the passion of love is to be conquered only by flying from it, and that no one should engage in a struggle with an enemy so mighty, for divine strength is needed to overcome his human power. Leonela alone knew of her mistress's weakness, for the two false friends and new lovers were unable to conceal it. Lothario did not care to tell Camilla the object Anselmo had in view, nor that he had afforded him the opportunity of attaining such a result, lest she should undervalue his love and think that it was by chance and without intending it, and not of his own accord that he had made love to her. A few days earlier Anselmo returned to his house, and did not perceive what it had lost, that which he so lightly treated and so highly prized. He went at once to see Lothario, and found him at home. They embraced each other, and Anselmo asked for tidings of his life or death. "The tidings I have to give thee, Anselmo, my friend," said Lothario, "are that thou dost possess a wife that is worthy to be the pattern and crown of all good wives. The words that I have addressed to her were borne away on the winds, my promises have been despised, my presents have been refused, such faint tears as I shed have been turned into open ridicule. In short, as Camilla is the essence of all beauty, so she is the treasure house where purity dwells, and gentleness and modesty abide, with all the virtues that can confer praise, honour, and happiness upon a woman. Take back thy money, my friend, here it is, and I have no need to touch it, for the chastity of Camilla yields not to things so base as gifts or promises. Be content, Anselmo, and refrain from making further proof, and as thou hast passed dryhood through the sea of these doubts and suspicions that are and may be entertained of woman, seek not to plunge again into the deep ocean of new embarrassments, or with another plot make trial of the goodness and strength of the bark that heaven has granted thee for thy passage across the sea of this world, but reckon thyself now safe in port, Moor thyself with the anchor of sound reflection, and rest in peace until thou art called upon to pay that debt which no nobility on earth can escape paying." Anselmo was completely satisfied by the words of Lothario, and believed them as fully as if they had been spoken by an oracle. Nevertheless, he begged of him not to relinquish the undertaking, were it but for the sake of curiosity and amusement. Though thenceforward he need not make use of the same earnest endeavours as before, all he wished him to do was to write some verses to her, praising her under the name of Chloris, for he himself would give her to understand that he was in love with the lady for whom he had given the name, to enable him to sing her praises with the decorum due to her modesty, and if Lothario were unwilling to take the trouble of writing the verses, he would compose them himself. "That will not be necessary," said Lothario, "for the Muses are not such enemies of mine, but that they visit me now and then in the course of the year. Do thou tell Camilla what thou hast proposed about a pretended amour of mine. As for the verses, we'll make them, and if not as good as the subject deserves, they shall be at least the best I can produce." An agreement to this effect was made between the friends, the ill-advised one and the treacherous, and Anselmo, returning to his house, asked Camilla the question she already wondered he had not asked before, what it was that caused her to write the letter she had sent him. Camilla replied that it had seemed to her that Lothario looked at her somewhat more freely than when he had been at home, but now she was undeceived and believed it to have been only her own imagination, for Lothario now avoided seeing her, or being alone with her. Anselmo told her that she might be quite easy on the score of that suspicion, for he knew that Lothario was in love with a damsel of rank in the city, whom he celebrated under the name of Chloris, and that even if he were not, his fidelity and their great friendship left no room for fear. Had not Camilla, however, been informed beforehand by Lothario that his love for Chloris was a pretence, and that he himself had told Anselmo of it in order to be able sometimes to give utterance to the praises of Camilla herself, no doubt she would have fallen into despairing toils of jealousy, but being forewarned, she received the startling news without uneasiness. The next day, as the three were at the table, Anselmo asked Lothario to recite something of what he had composed for his mistress Chloris, for as Camilla did not know her, he might safely say what he liked. "Even did she know her," returned Lothario, "I would hide nothing, for when a lover praises this lady's beauty, and charges her with cruelty, he casts no imputation upon her fair name. At any rate, all I can say is that yesterday I made a sonnet on the ingratitude of this Chloris, which goes thus: At midnight, in the silence, when the eyes of happier mortals balmy slumbers close, the weary tale of my unnumbered woes to Chloris and to heaven is wont to rise. And when the light of day, returning, dies, the portal of the east, with tints of rose, with undiminished force my sorrow flows in broken accents and in burning sighs. And when the sun ascends his star-girt throne, and on the earth pours down his midday beams, noon but renews my wailing and my tears, and with the night again goes up my moan. Yet ever in my agony it seems to me that neither heaven nor Chloris hears." The sonnet pleased Camilla, and still more Anselmo, for he praised it, and the lady was excessively cruel, who made no return for sincerity so manifest. On which Camilla said, "Then all that love-smitten poets say is true?" "As poets they do not tell the truth," replied Lothario, "but as lovers they are not more defective in expression than they are truthful." "There is no doubt of that," observed Anselmo, anxious to support and uphold Lothario's ideas with Camilla, who was as regardless of his design as she was deep in love with Lothario, and so, taking delight in anything that was his, and knowing what his thoughts and writings had her for their object, and that she herself was the real Chloris, she asked him to repeat some other sonnet or verses if he recollected any. "I do," replied Lothario, "but I do not think it as good as the first one, or, more correctly speaking, was bad, but you can easily judge, for it is this: I know that I am doomed. Death is to me as certain as that thou, ungrateful fair, dead at thy feet shouldst see me lying ere my heart repented of its love for thee. If buried in oblivion I should be, bereft of life, fame, favour, even there it would be found that I thy image bear, deep graven in my breast for all to see. This like some holy relic do I prize, to save me from the fate my truth entails, truth that to thy hard heart its vigour owes. Alas for him that under lowering skies in peril o'er trackless ocean sails, where neither friendly port nor pole star shows." Anselmo praised the second sonnet too, as he had praised the first, and so he went on adding link after link to the chain with which he was binding himself and making his dishonour secure. For when Lothario was doing most dishonour to him, he told him he was most honoured, and thus each step that Camilla descended towards the depths of her abasement, she mounted, in his opinion, toward the summit of virtue and fair fame. It so happened that, finding herself on one occasion alone with her maid, Camilla said to her, "I am ashamed to think, my dear Leonela, how lightly I have valued myself, that I did not compel Lothario to purchase, by at least some expenditure of time, that full possession of me that I so quickly yielded to him of my own free will. I fear that he will think ill of my pliancy or lightness, not considering the irresistible influence he brought to bear upon me." "Let not that trouble you, my lady," said Leonela, "for it does not take away the value of the thing given, or make it less precious to give it quickly, if it be really valuable and worthy of being prized. Nay, they are wont to say that he who gives quickly gives twice." "They also say," said Camilla, "that what costs little is valued less." "That saying does not hold good in your case," replied Leonela, "for love, as I have heard say, sometimes flies and sometimes walks. With this one it runs. With that it moves slowly, some it cools, others it burns, some it wounds, others it slays. It begins the course of its desires, and at the same moment completes and ends it. In the morning it will lay siege to a fortress, and by night will have taken it, for there is no power that can resist it. So what are you in dread of, what do you fear, when the same must have befallen Lothario, love having chosen the absence of my lord as the instrument for subduing you? And it was absolutely necessary to complete, then, what love has resolved upon, without affording the time to let Anselmo return and by his presence compel the work to be left unfinished. For love has no better agent for carrying out his designs than opportunity, and of opportunity he avails himself in all his feats, especially at the outset. All this I know well myself, more by experience than by hearsay, and some day, señora, I will enlighten you on the subject, for I am of your flesh and blood too. Moreover, Lady Camilla, you did not surrender yourself, or yield so quickly, but that first you saw Lothario's whole soul in his eyes, in his sighs, in his words, his promises, and his gifts, and by it and his good qualities perceived how worthy he was of your love. This, then, being the case, let not these scrupulous and prudish ideas trouble your imagination, but be assured that Lothario prizes you as you do him, and rest content and satisfied that as you are caught in the noose of love, it is one of worth and merit that has taken you, and one that has not only the 4 S's that they say true lovers ought to have, but a complete alphabet. Only listen to me, and you will see how I can repeat it by rote. He is to my eyes and thinking, amiable, brave, courteous, distinguished, elegant, fond, gay, honourable, illustrious, loyal, manly, noble, open, polite, quick-witted, rich, and the S's according to the saying, and then tender, veracious, X does not suit him, for it is a rough letter, Y has been given already, and Z zealous for your honour. Camilla laughed at her maid's alphabet, and perceived her to be more experienced in love's affairs than she said, which she admitted, confessing to Camilla that she had love passages with a young man of good birth of the same city. Camilla was uneasy at this, dreading lest it might prove the means of endangering her honour, and asked whether her intrigue had gone beyond words, and she, with little shame and much effrontery, said it had, for certain it is that ladies' imprudences make servants shameless, who, when they see their mistresses make a false step, think nothing of going astray themselves, or of its being known. All that Camilla could do was to entreat Lothario to say nothing about her doings to him whom she called her lover, and to conduct her own affairs secretly, lest they should come to the knowledge of Anselmo or of Lothario. Leonela said she would, but kept her word in such a way that she confirmed Camilla's apprehension of losing her reputation through her means. For this abandoned and bold Leonela, as soon as she perceived that her mistress' demeanour was not what it was wont to be, had the audacity to introduce her lover into the house, confident that even if her mistress saw him, she would not dare to expose him, for the sins of mistresses entail this mischief among them. They make themselves the slave of their own servants, and are obliged to hide their laxities and depravities, as was the case with Camilla, who, though she perceived, not once but many times, that Leonela was with her lover in some room of the house, not only did not dare to chide them, but afforded her opportunities for concealing him, and removed all difficulties lest he should be seen by her husband. She was unable, however, to prevent him from being seen on one occasion as he sallied forth at daybreak by Lothario, who, not knowing who he was, at first took him for a spectre, but as soon as he saw him hasten away, muffling his face with the cloak and concealing himself carefully and cautiously, he rejected this foolish idea and adopted another, which would have been the ruin of all had not Camilla found a remedy. It did not occur to Lothario that this man he had seen issuing at such an untimely hour from Anselmo's house could have entered it on Leonella's account, nor did he remember there was such a person as Leonela. All he thought that was as Camilla had been light and yielding with him, so she had been with another. For this further penalty the erring woman's sin bring with it, that her honour is distrusted even by him whose overtures and persuasions she has yielded, and he believes her to have surrendered more easily to others, and gives implicit credence to every suspicion that comes into his mind. All Lothario's good sense seems to have failed him at this juncture. All his prudent maxims escaped his memory, for without once reflecting rationally, and without more ado, in his impatience and in the blindness of the jealous rage that gnawed his heart, and dying to revenge himself upon Camilla, who had done him no wrong, before Anselmo had risen, he hastened him and said, "Know, Anselmo, that for several days past I have been struggling with myself, striving to withhold from thee what is no longer possible or right that I should conceal from thee. Know that Camilla's fortress has surrendered, and is ready to submit to my will, and if I have been slow to reveal this fact to thee, it was in order to see if there were some light caprice of hers, or if she sought to try me and ascertain if the love I began to make to her with thy permission was made with a serious intention. I thought too that if she were what she ought to be, and what we both believed her, would have ere this given thee information of my addresses, but seeing that she delays, I believe the truth of the promise she has given me. The next time thou art absent from the house, she will grant me an interview in the closet where thy jewels are kept." It was true that Camilla used to meet him there. "But I do not wish thee to rush precipitately to take vengeance, for the sin is as yet only committed in intention, and Camilla's may change, perhaps, between this and the appointed time, and repentance spring up in its place. As hitherto thou hast always followed my advice wholly, or in part, follow and observe this that I will give thee now, so that without mistake and with mature deliberation thou mayst satisfy thyself as to what may seem the best course. Pretend to absent thyself for 2 or 3 days, as thou hast been wont to do on other occasions, and contrive to hide thyself in the closet, for the tapestries and other things there afford great facilities for thy concealment, and then thou wilt see with thine own eyes, and I with mine, what Camilla's purpose may be. And if it be a guilty one, which may be feared rather than expected, with silence, prudence, and discretion thou canst thyself become the instrument of punishment for the wrong done thee." Anselmo was amazed and overwhelmed and astounded at the words of Lothario, which came upon him at a time when he least expected to hear them, for he now looked upon Camilla as having triumphed over the pretended attacks of Lothario, and was beginning to enjoy the glory of her victory. He remained silent for a considerable time, looking on the ground with fixed gaze, and at length said, "Thou hast behaved, Lothario, as I expected of thy friendship. I will follow thy advice in everything. Do as thou wilt, and keep this secret as thou seest it should be kept in circumstance so unlooked for." Lothario gave him his word, but after leaving him he repented altogether of what he had said to him, perceiving how foolishly he had acted, as he might have revenged himself upon Camilla in some less cruel and degrading way. He cursed his want of sense, condemned his hasty resolution, and knew not what course to take to undo the mischief or find some ready escape from it. At last he decided upon revealing all to Camilla, and as there was no want of opportunity for doing so, he found her alone the same day, but she, as soon as she had the chance of speaking to him, said, "Lothario, my friend, I must tell thee, I have a sorrow in my heart which fills it so it seems ready to burst, and it will be wonder if it does not, for the audacity of Leonela has now reached such a pitch that every night she conceals a gallant of hers in this house, and remains with him till morning at the expense of my reputation, inasmuch as it is open to any one to question it who may see him quitting my house at such unseasonable hours. But what distresses me is that I cannot punish or chide her, for her privity to our intrigue bridles my mouth and keeps me silent about hers, while I am dreading that some catastrophe will come of it." As Camilla said this, Lothario at first imagined it was some device to delude him into the idea that the man he had seen going out was Leonela's lover, not hers, but when he saw how she wept and suffered, and begged him to help her, he became convinced of the truth, and the conviction completed his confusion and remorse. However, he told Camilla not to distress herself, as he would take measures to put a stop to the insolence of Leonela. At the same time he told her what, driven by the fierce rage of jealousy, he had said to Anselmo, and how he had arranged to hide himself in the closet, that he might there see plainly how little she preserved her fidelity to him. And he entreated her to pardon for this madness, and her advice as to how to repair it, and escape safely from the intricate labyrinth in which his imprudence had involved him. Camilla was struck with alarm at hearing what Lothario had said, and with much anger and great good sense she reproved him, and rebuked his base design and the foolish and mischievous resolution he had made. But as woman has by nature a nimbler wit than man for good and for evil, though it is apt to fail when she sets herself deliberately to reason, Camilla on the spur of the moment thought of a way to remedy what was all appearance irremediable, and told Lothario to contrive that the next day Anselmo should conceal himself in the place he mentioned, for she hoped from his concealment to obtain the means of their enjoying themselves for the future without any apprehension. And without revealing her purpose to him entirely, she charged him to be careful, as soon as Anselmo was concealed, to come to her when Leonela should call him, and to all she said to him to answer as he would have answered had he not known that Anselmo was listening. Lothario pressed her to explain her intention fully, so that he might with more certainty and precaution take care to do what he saw to be needful. "I tell you," said Camilla, "there is nothing to take care of except to answer me what I shall ask you." For she did not wish to explain to him beforehand what she meant to do, fearing lest he should be unwilling to follow out an idea which seemed to her such a good one, and should try to devise some other less practicable plan. Lothario then retired, and the next day Anselmo, under pretence of going to his friend's country house, took his departure, and then returned to conceal himself, which he was able to do easily, as Camilla and Leonela took care to give him the opportunity. And so he placed himself in hiding in the statue of agitation that it may be imagined he would feel, who expected to see the vitals of his honour laid bare before his eyes, and found himself on the point of losing the supreme blessing he thought he possessed in his beloved Camilla. Having made sure of Anselmo's being in his hiding-place, Camilla and Leonela entered the closet, and the instant she set foot within it, Camilla said with a deep sigh, "Ah, dear Leonela, would it not be better, before I do what I am unwilling, you should know, lest you should seek to prevent it, that you should take Anselmo's dagger that I have asked of you, and with it pierce this vile heart of mine? But no, there is no reason why I should suffer the punishment of another's fault. I will first know what it is that the bold licentious eyes of Lothario have seen in me, that could have encouraged him to reveal to me a design so base as that which he has disclosed, regardless of his friend and of my honour. Go to the window, Leonela, and call him, for no doubt he is in the street waiting to carry out his vile project. But mine, cruel it may be, but honourable, shall be carried out first." "Ah, señora," said the crafty Leonela, who knew her part, "what is it you want to do with this dagger? Can it be that you want to take your own life or Lothario's? For whichever you mean to do, it will lead to the loss of your reputation and good name. It is better to dissemble your wrong, and not give this wicked man the chance of entering the house now and finding us alone. Consider, señora, we are weak women, and he is a man, and determined, and as he comes with such a base purpose, blind and urged by passion, perhaps you can put yours into execution. He may do what will be worse for you than taking your life. I'll betide my master Anselmo for giving such authority in his house to this shameless fellow, and supposing you kill him, señora, as I suspect you mean to do, what shall we do with him when he is dead?" "What, my friend," replied Camilla, "we shall leave him for Anselmo to bury him, for in reason it will be to him a light labour to hide his own infamy underground. Summon him, make haste, for all the time I delay in taking vengeance for my wrong seems to me an offence against the loyalty I owe my husband." Anselmo was listening to all this, and every word that Camilla uttered made him change his mind, but when he heard that it was resolved to kill Lothario, his first impulse was to come out and show himself to avert such a disaster. But in his anxiety to see the issue of a resolution so bold and virtuous, he restrained himself, and sending to come forth to prevent the deed in time. At this moment Camilla, throwing herself upon a bed that was close by, swooned away, and Leonela began to weep bitterly, exclaiming, "Woe is me that I should be fated to have dying here in my arms, the flower of virtue upon earth, the crown of true wives, the pattern of chastity," with more to the same effect, so that anyone who heard her would have taken her for the most tender-hearted and faithful handmaid in the world, and her mistress for another persecuted Penelope. Camilla was not long in recovering from her fainting fit, and on coming to herself she said, "Why do you not go, Leonela, to call hither that friend, the falsest to his friend the sun ever shone upon, or night concealed? Away, run, haste, speed, lest the fire of my wrath burn itself out with delay, and the righteous vengeance that I hope for melt away in menaces and maledictions." "I am just going to call him, señora," said Leonela, "but first you must give me that dagger, lest while I am gone you should by means of it give cause to all who love you to weep all their lives." "Go in peace, dear Leonela, I will not do so," said Camilla, "for rash and foolish as I may be to your mind, in defending my honour I am not going to be so much as that Lucretia, who they say killed herself without having done anything wrong, without having first killed him on whom the ground of her misfortune lay. I shall die if I am to die, but it must be after full vengeance upon him who has brought me here to weep over audacity that no fault of mine gave birth to." Leonela required much pressing before she would go to summon Lothario, but at last she went, and while awaiting her return, Camilla continued, as if speaking to herself, "Good God! Would it not have been more prudent to have repulsed Lothario, as I have done many a time before, than to allow him, as I am now doing, to think me unchaste and vile, even for the short time I must wait until I undeceive him? No doubt it would have been better, but I should not be avenged, nor the honour of my husband vindicated, should he find so clear and easy an escape from the strait into which his depravity has led him. Let the traitor pay with his life for the temerity of his wanton wishes, and let the world know, if haply it shall ever come to know, that Camilla not only preserved her allegiance to her husband, but avenged him of the man who dared to wrong him. Still, I think it might be better to disclose this to Anselmo. But then I have called his attention to it in the letter I wrote him in the country, and if he did nothing to prevent the mischief I there pointed out to him, I suppose it was from pure goodness of heart and trustfulness. He would not, and could not, believe that any thought against his honour could harbour in the breast of so staunch a friend, nor indeed did I myself believe it for many days, nor should I have ever believed it if his insolence had not gone so far as to make manifest by open presents, lavish promises, and ceaseless tears. But why do I argue this? Does a bold determination stand in need of arguments? Surely not. And traitors, avaunt! Vengeance to my aid! Let the false one come, approach, advance, die, yield up his life, and then befall what may. Pure I came to him who heaven bestowed upon me, pure I shall leave him, and at the worst bathed in my own chaste blood, and in the foul blood of the falsest friend that friendship ever saw in the world. And as she uttered these words, she paced the room, holding the unsheathed dagger with such irregular and disordered steps, and such gestures, that one would have supposed her to have lost her senses, and taken her for some violent desperado instead of a delicate woman. Anselmo, hidden behind some tapestries where he had concealed himself, beheld and was amazed by all, and already felt that what he had seen and heard was a sufficient answer to even greater suspicions, and he would have been now well pleased if the proof afforded by Lothario's coming were dispensed with, as he feared some sudden mishap. But as he was on the point of showing himself and coming forth to embrace and undeceive his wife, he paused as he saw Leonela returning, leading Lothario. Camilla, when she saw him, drawing a long line in front of her on the floor with the dagger, said to him, "Lothario, pay attention to what I say to thee. If by any chance thou darest to cross this line thou seest, or even approachest it, the instant I see thee attempt it, that same instant will I pierce my bosom with this dagger that I hold in my hand. And before thou answerest me a word, desire thee to listen to a few from me, and afterwards thou shalt reply as may please thee. First, I desire to tell me, Lothario, if thou knowest my husband Anselmo, and in what light thou regardest him, and secondly, I desire to know if thou knowest me too. Answer me this without embarrassment, or reflecting deeply what thou wilt answer, for they are no riddles I put to thee." Lothario was not so dull but that from the first instance when Camilla directed him to make Anselmo hide himself, he understood what she intended to do, and therefore he fell in with her idea so readily and promptly that between them they made the imposture look more true than truth. So he answered her thus: "I did not think, fair Camilla, that thou wert calling me to ask me questions that remote from the object with which I come. But if it is to defer the promised reward thou art doing so, thou mightst have put it off still longer, for the longing for happiness gives the more distress, and nearer comes the hope of gaining it. But lest thou shouldst say that I do not answer thy questions, I say that I know thy husband Anselmo, and that we have known each other from our earliest years. I will not speak of what thou too knowest of our friendship, that I may not compel myself to testify against the wrong that love, the mighty excuse for greater errors, makes me inflict upon him. Thee I know, and hold in the same estimation as he does, for were it not so, I had not for a lesser prize acted in opposition to what I owe my station in the holy laws of true friendship, now broken and violated by me through that powerful enemy love." "If thou dost confess that," returned Camilla, "mortal enemy of all that rightly deserves to be loved, with what face dost thou dare to come before one who thou knowest to be the mirror wherein he is reflected, on whom thou shouldst look to see how unworthily thou him? But woe is me, I now comprehend what has made thee give so little heed to what thou owest to thyself. It must have been some freedom of mine, for I will not call it a modesty, as it did not proceed from any deliberate intention, but from some heedlessness such as women are guilty of through inadvertence when they have no occasion for reserve. But tell me, traitor, when did I by word or sign give a reply to thy prayers that could awaken in thee a shadow of hope of attaining thy base wishes? When were not thy professions of love sternly and scornfully rejected and rebuked? When were thy frequent pledges and still more frequent gifts believed or accepted? But as I am persuaded that no one can long persevere in the attempt to win love unsustained by some hope, I am willing to attribute to myself the blame of thy assurance, for no doubt some thoughtlessness of mine has all this time fostered thy hopes, and therefore will I punish myself and inflict upon myself the penalty thy guilt deserves, and that thou mayest see that being so relentless to myself I cannot possibly be otherwise to thee. I have summoned thee to be a witness of the sacrifice I mean to offer to the injured honour of my honoured husband, wronged by thee with all the assiduity thou wert capable, and by me too, though want of caution in avoiding every occasion, if I have given any, of encouraging and sanctioning thy base designs. Once more I say that suspicion in my mind that some imprudence of mine has engendered these lawless thoughts in thee is what causes me most distress, and what I desire to punish with my own hands. For were any other instrument of punishment employed, my error might become what causes me distress, and what I desire my error might become widely known. But before I do so, in my death I mean to inflict death, and take with me one that will satisfy my longing for the revenge I hope for and have. For I shall see, wheresoever it may be that I go, the penalty awarded by inflexible, unswerving justice on him who has placed me in a position so desperate. As she uttered these words with incredible energy and swiftness, she flew upon Lothario with a naked dagger, so manifestly burnt on burying it in his breast that he was almost uncertain whether these demonstrations were real or feigned, for he was obliged to have recourse to all his skill and strength to prevent her from striking him. And with such reality did she act at this strange farce and mystification that, to give it a colour of truth, she determined to stain it with her own blood, for, perceiving her pretending that she could not wound Lothario, she said, "Fate, it seems, will not grant my desire complete satisfaction, but it will not be able to keep me from satisfying it partially at least," and, making an effort to free the hand with the dagger which Lothario held in his grasp, she released it, and, directing the point to a place where it could not inflict a deep wound, she plunged it into her left side, high up close to the shoulder, and then allowed herself to fall to the ground as if in a faint. Leonela and Lothario stood amazed and astounded at the catastrophe, and seeing Camilla stretched on the ground and bathed in her blood, they were still uncertain as to the true nature of the act. Lothario, terrified and breathless, ran in haste to pluck out the dagger, but when he saw how slight the wound was, he, relieved of his fears, once more admired the subtlety, coolness, and ready wit of the fair Camilla, and the better to support the part he had to play, he began to utter profuse, doleful lamentations over her body as if she were dead, invoking maledictions not only on himself but also on him who had been the means of placing him in such a position. And knowing that his friend Anselmo heard him, he spoke in such a way as to make a listener feel much more pity for him than for Camilla, even though he supposed her dead. Leonela took her up in her arms and laid her on the bed, entreating Lothario to go in quest of someone to attend to her wound in secret, and at the same time asking his advice and opinion as to what they should say to Anselmo about his lady's wound if he should chance to return before it was healed. He replied they might say what they liked, for he was not in a state to give advice that would be of any use. All he could tell her was to try and stanch the blood, as he was going where he should never more be seen, and with every appearance of deep grief and sorrow he left the house. But when he found himself alone, and where there was nobody to see him, he crossed himself unceasingly, lost in wonder at the adroitness of Camilla, and the consistent acting of Leonela. He reflected how convinced Anselmo would be that he had a second Portia for a wife, and he looked forward anxiously to meeting him in order to rejoice together over falsehood and truth, the most craftily veiled that could be imagined. Leonela, as he told her, stanched her lady's blood, which was no more than sufficed to support her deception, and washing the wound with a little wine, she bound it up to the best of her skill, taking all the time she was sending her in a strain that, even if nothing else had been said before, would have been enough to assure Anselmo that he had in Camilla a model of purity. To Leonela's word Camilla added her own, calling herself cowardly and wanting in spirit, since she had not at the time she had most need of it to rid herself of the life she so much loathed. She asked her attendant's advice as to whether or not she ought to inform her beloved husband of all that had happened, but the other bade her to say nothing about it, as she would lay upon him the obligation of taking vengeance on Lothario. which he could not do but at great risk to himself, and it was the duty of a true wife not to give her husband provocation to quarrel, but on the contrary to remove it as far as possible from him. Camilla replied that she believed she was right, and that she would follow her advice, but at any rate it would be well to consider how she was to explain the wound to Anselmo, for he could not help seeing it, to which Leonela answered that she did not know how to tell a lie even in jest. "How then can I know, my dear?" said Camilla, "for I should not dare to forge or keep up a falsehood if my life depended on it. If we can think of no escape from the difficulty, it will be better to tell him the plain truth than he should find us out in an untrue story." "Be not uneasy, señora," said Leonela. "Between this and tomorrow I will think of that which we must say to him, and perhaps, the wound being where it is, can be hidden from sight, and heaven will be pleased to aid us in a purpose so good and honourable. Compose yourself, señora, and endeavour to calm your excitement, lest my lord find you agitated, and leave the rest to my care and God's, who always supports good intentions." Anselmo had with the deepest attention listened to and seen played out the tragedy of the death of his honour, which the performers acted with such wonderfully effective truth that it seemed as if they had become the realities of the parts they played. He longed for night and an opportunity of escaping from the house to go and see his good friend Lothario, and with him give vent to his joy over the precious pearl he had gained in having established his wife's purity. Both mistress and maid took care to leave him an opportunity to give him time and opportunity to get away, and taking advantage of it he made his escape, and at once he went in quest of Lothario, and it would be impossible to describe how he embraced him when he found him, and the things he said to him in the joy of his heart, and the praises he bestowed upon Camilla, all which Lothario listened to without being able to show any pleasure, for he could not forget how deceived his friend was, and how dishonourably he had wronged him, and though Anselmo could see that Lothario was not glad, still he imagined it was only because he had left Camilla wounded and had himself been the cause of it, and so among other things he told himself not to be distressed about Camilla's accident, for as they had agreed to hide it from him, the wound was evidently trifling, and that being so, he had no cause for fear, but should henceforward be of good cheer and rejoice with him, seeing that by his means and adroitness he found himself raised to the greatest height of happiness that he could venture to hope for, and desired no better pastime than making verses in praise of Camilla that would preserve her name for all time to come. Lothario commended his purpose, and promised on his own part to aid him in raising a monument so glorious. And so Anselmo was left the most charmingly hoodwinked man there could be in the world. He himself, persuaded he was conducting the instrument of his glory, led home by the hand him who had been the utter destruction of his good name, whom Camilla received with averted countenance, though with smiles in her heart. The deception was carried on for some time, until at the end of the few months fortune turned her wheel, and the guilt which had been until then so skilfully concealed was published abroad, and Anselmo paid with his life the penalty of his ill-advised curiosity. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35, which treats of the heroic and prodigious battle Don Quixote had with certain skins of red wine, and brings the novel of the ill-advised curiosity to a close. There remained but little more of the novel to be read when Sancho Panza burst forth in wild excitement from the garret where Don Quixote was lying, shouting, "Run, sirs, quick, and help my master, who is in the thick of the toughest and stiffest battle I have ever laid eyes on. By the living God, he has given the giant, the enemy of the lady princess Micomicona, such a slash that he has sliced his head clean off, as it were a turnip." "What are you talking about, brother?" said the curate, pausing as he was about to read the remainder of the novel. "Are you in your senses, Sancho? How the devil can it be as you say, when the giant is 2,000 leagues away?" Here they heard a loud noise in the chamber, and Don Quixote shouting, "Stand, thief, brigand, villain! Now have I got thee, and thy scimitar shall not avail thee." And then it seemed as though he were slashing vigorously at the wall. "Don't stop to listen," said Sancho, "but go in and part them, or help my master, though there is no need of that now, for no doubt the giant is dead by this time, and giving account to God of his wicked past life, for I saw the blood flowing on the ground, and the head cut off and fallen on one side, and it is as big as a large wineskin." "May I die," said the landlord at this, "if Don Quixote or Don Devil has not been slashing some of the skins of red wine that stand full at his bed's head, and the spilt wine must be what his good fellow takes for blood." And so saying, he went into his room, and the rest after him, and there they found Don Quixote in the strangest costume in the world. He was in his shirt, which was not long enough in front to cover his thighs completely, and was 6 fingers shorter behind. His legs were very long and lean, covered with hair, and anything but clean. On his head he had a little greasy red cap that belonged to the host. round his arm he had rolled the blanket of the bed, to which Sancho, for reasons best known to himself, owed a grudge, and in his right hand he held his unsheathed sword, with which he was slashing about on all sides, uttering exclamations as if he were actually fighting some giant, and the best of it was his eyes were not open, for he was fast asleep, and dreaming that he was doing battle with a giant. For his imagination was so wrought upon by the adventure he was going to accomplish that it made him dream he had already reached the kingdom of Micomicon and was engaged in combat with his enemy, and believing he was laying on the giant, he had given so many sword cuts to the skin that the whole room was full of wine. On seeing this, the landlord was so enraged that he fell on Don Quixote, and with his clenched fists began to pummel him in such a way that if Cardenio and the curate had not dragged him off, he would have brought the war of the giant to an end. But in spite of all, the poor gentleman never woke
until the barber brought a great pot of cold water from the well and flung it with one dash all over his body, on which Don Quixote woke up, but not so completely as to understand
what was the matter. Dorothea, seeing how short and slight his attire was, would not go in to witness the battle between her champion and her opponent. As for Sancho, he went searching all over the floor for the head of the giant, and not finding it, he said, "I see now that it's all enchantment in this house, for the last time, on this very spot where I am now, I got ever so many thumps without knowing who gave them to me, or being able to see anybody, and now this head is not to be seen anywhere about, though I saw it cut off with my own eyes, and the blood running from the body as if from a fountain." "What blood and fountains are you talking about, enemy of God and his saints?" said the landlord. "Don't you see, you thief, that the blood in the fountain are only these skins that have been stabbed and the red wine swimming all over the room? And I wish I saw the soul of him that stabbed them swimming in hell." "I know nothing about that," said Sancho. "All I know is that it will be bad luck that through not finding this head my country will melt away like salt in water." For Sancho awake was worse than his master asleep, so much his master's promises addled his wits. The landlord was beside himself at the coolness of the squire and the mischievous doings of the master, and swore it should not be like the last time when they went without paying, and that their privileges of chivalry should not hold good this time to let one or the other of them without paying, even to the cost of the plugs that would have to be put to the damaged wineskins. The curate was holding Don Quixote's hands, who, fancying he had now ended the adventure, and was in the presence of the Princess Micomicona, knelt before the curate and said, "Exalted and beauteous lady, your highness may live from this day forth, fearless of any harm this base being could do you, and I too, from this day forth, am released from the promise I gave you, since, by the help of God on high, and by the favour of her by whom I live and breathe, I have fulfilled it so successfully." "Did not I say so?" said Sancho on hearing this. "You see, I wasn't drunk, and there, you see, my master has already salted the giant. There's no doubt about the balls, my country is all right." Who could have helped laughing at the absurdities of the pair, master and man? And laugh they did, all except the landlord, who cursed himself, but at length the barber, Cardenio, and the curate contrived with no small trouble to get Don Quixote on the bed, and he fell asleep with every appearance of excessive weariness. They left him to sleep, and came out to the gate of the inn to console Sancho Panza for not having found the head of the giant, but much more work had they to appease the landlord, who was furious at the sudden death of his wineskins, and said the landlady, half scolding, half crying, "At an evil moment, and in such an unlucky hour, he came into my house, this knight-errant. Would that I had never set eyes on him, for dear he has cost me. The last time he went off with the overnight score against him for supper, bed, straw, and barley, for himself and his squire, and a hack and an ass, saying he was a knight adventurer. God send unlucky adventures to him and all the adventurers in the world, and therefore not bound to pay anything, for it was so settled by the knight-errantry tariff. And then, all because of him, came the other gentleman and carried off my tail, and gives it back more than 2 curatillas the worse, all stripped of its hair, so that it is not for my husband's purpose, and then, for a finishing touch to all, to burst my wineskins and spill my wine. I wish I saw his own blood spilt, but let him not deceive himself, for by the bones of my father and the shade of my mother they shall pay me down every quartz, or my name is not what it is, and I am not my father's daughter." All this and more to the same effect the landlady delivered with great irritation, and her good maid Maritornes backed her up, while the daughter held her peace and smiled from time to time. The curate smoothed matters by promising to make good all losses to the best of his power, not only as regarded the wineskin, but also the wine, and above all the depreciation of the tail which they set such store by. Dorothea comforted Sancho, telling him that she pledged herself, as soon as it should appear certain that his master had decapitated the giant, and she found herself peacefully established in her kingdom, to bestow upon him the best county there was in it. With this Sancho consoled himself, and assured the princess she might rely upon it that he had seen the head of the giant, and more by token it had a beard that reached to the girdle, and that if it was not to be seen now, it was because everything that happened in that house went by enchantment, as he himself had proved the last time he had lodged there. Dorothea said that she fully believed it, and that he need not be uneasy, for all would go well and turn out as he wished. And therefore, being appeased, the curate was anxious to go on with the novel, as he saw there was but little more left to read. Dorothea and the others begged him to finish it, and he, as he was willing to please them and enjoyed reading it himself, continued the tale in these words. The result was that from the confidence Anselmo felt in Camilla's virtue, he lived happily and free from anxiety, and Camilla purposely looked coldly on Lothario, that Anselmo might suppose her feelings towards him to be the opposite of what they were, and the better to support the position, Lothario begged to be excused from coming to the house, as the displeasure with which Camilla regarded his presence was plain to be seen. But the befooled Anselmo said he would on no account allow such a thing, and so in 1,000 ways became the author of his own dishonour, while he believed he was ensuring his happiness. Meanwhile, the satisfaction with which Leonela saw herself empowered to carry on her amour reached such a height that, regardless of everything else, she followed her inclinations unrestrainedly, feeling confident that her mistress would screen her, and even show her how to manage it safely. At last one night Anselmo heard footsteps in Leonela's room, and on trying to enter to see who it was, he found that the door was held against him, which made him all the more determined to open it, and exerting his strength he forced it open, and entered the room in time to see a man leaping through the window into the street. He ran quickly to seize him or discover who he was, but he was unable to effect either purpose, for Leonela flung her arms round him, crying, "Be calm, señor, do not give way to passion, or follow him who has escaped from this. He belongs to me, and in fact he is my husband." Anselmo would not believe it, but blind with rage he drew a dagger and threatened to stab Leonela, bidding her to tell her the truth or he would kill her. She, in fear, not knowing what she was saying, exclaimed, do not kill me, señor, for I can tell you more important things than any you can imagine." "Tell me then at once, or thou diest," said Anselmo. "It would be impossible for me now," said Leonela. "I am so agitated. Leave me till tomorrow, and then you shall hear from me what will fill thou with astonishment. But rest assured that he who leaped through the windows is a young man of this city, who has given me his promise to become my husband." Anselmo was appeased with this, and was content to wait the time she asked of him, for he never expected to hear anything against Camilla, so satisfied and sure of her virtue was he, and so he quitted the room and left Leonela locked in, telling her she should not come out until she had told him all she had to make known to him. He went at once to see Camilla, and tell her, as he did, all that passed between him and her handymaid, and the promise she had given to inform him of matters of serious importance. There is no saying whether Camilla was agitated or not, for so great was her fear and dismay, that making sure, as she had good reason to do, that Leonela would tell Anselmo all she knew of her faithlessness, she had not the courage to wait and see if her suspicions were confirmed, and that same night, as soon as she thought that Anselmo was asleep, she packed up the most valuable jewels she had and some money, without being observed by anybody, escaped from the house, and betook herself to Lothario's, to whom she related what had occurred, imploring him to convey her to some place of safety, or to fly with her, where they might be safe from Anselmo. The state of perplexity to which Camilla reduced Lothario was such that he was unable to utter a word in reply, still less to decide upon what he should do. At length he resolved to conduct her to a convent to which a sister of his was prioress. Camilla agreed to this, and with the speed which the circumstances demanded, Lothario took her to the convent and left her there, and then himself quitted the city without letting anyone know of his departure. As soon as daylight came, Anselmo, without missing Camilla from his side, rose, eager to learn what Leonela had to tell him, and hastened to the room where he had locked her in. He entered, he opened the door, but found no Leonela. All he found was some sheets knotted to the window, a plain proof that she had let herself down from it and escaped. He returned uneasily to tell Camilla, but not finding her in bed or anywhere in the house, he was lost in amazement. He asked servants of the house about her, but none of them could give him any explanation. As he was going in search of Camilla, it happened by chance that he observed her boxes were lying open, and that the greater part of her jewels were gone, and now he became fully aware of his disgrace, and that Leonela was not the cause of his misfortune, and Just as he was, without delaying to dress himself completely, he repaired, sad at heart and dejected, to his friend Lothario to make known his sorrow to him. But when he failed to find him, and his servants reported that he had been absent from his house all night and had taken with him all the money he had, he felt as though he were losing his senses, and to make all complete on returning to his own house, he found it deserted and empty, not one of all his servants, male or female, remaining in it. He knew not what to think, or say, or do, and his reason seemed to be deserting him little by little. He reviewed his position, and saw himself in a moment left without wife, friend, or servants, abandoned, he felt, by the heavens above him, and more than all, robbed of his honour, for in Camilla's disappearance he saw his own ruin. After long reflection, he resolved at last to go to his friend's village, where he had been staying when he afforded opportunities for the contrivance of this complication of misfortune. He had locked the doors of his house, mounted his horse, and with a broken spirit set out on his journey. But he had hardly gone half-way when, harassed by his reflections, he had to dismount and tie his horse to a tree, and at the foot of which he threw himself, giving vent to piteous heart-rending sighs, and there he remained till nearly nightfall, when he observed a man approaching on horseback from the city, of whom, after saluting him, he asked what was the news in Florence. The citizen replied, "The strangest that have been heard for many a day, for it is reported abroad that Lothario, a great friend of the wealthy Anselmo, who lived at San Giovanni, carried off last night Camilla, the wife of Anselmo, who also has disappeared. All this has been told by a maidservant of Camilla's, whom the governor found last night lowering herself by a sheet from the windows of Anselmo's house. I know not indeed precisely how the affair came to pass. All I know is that the whole city is wondering at the occurrence, for no one could have expected a thing of the kind, seeing the great and intimate friendship that existed between them, so great, they say, that they were called the two friends." "Is it known at all," said Anselmo, "what road Lothario and Camilla took?" "Not in the least," said the citizen, "though the governor has been very active in searching for them." "God speed you, señor," said Anselmo. "God be with you," said the citizen, and went on his way. This disastrous intelligence almost robbed Anselmo not only of his senses but of his life. He got up as well as he was able and reached the house of his friend, who as yet knew nothing of his misfortune, but seeing him come pale, worn, and haggard, perceived that he was suffering some heavy affliction. Anselmo at once begged to be allowed to retire to rest, and to be given writing materials. His wish was complied with, and he was left lying down and alone, for he desired this, and even that the door should be locked. Finding himself alone, so he took to heart the thought of his misfortune, that by the signs of death he felt within him, he knew well his life was drawing to a close, and therefore he resolved to leave behind him a declaration of the cause of his strange end. He began to write, but before he had put down all he meant to say, his breath failed him, and he yielded up his life, a victim to the suffering which his ill-advised curiosity had entailed upon him. The master of the house, observing that it was now late, and that Anselmo did not call, determined to go in and ascertain if his disposition was increasing, and found him lying on his face, his body partly in bed, partly on the writing table, on which he lay with the written paper open and the pen still in his hand. Having first called him without receiving any answer, his host approached him, and, taking him by the hand, found that it was cold, and saw that he was dead. Greatly surprised and distressed, he summoned the household to witness the sad fate which had befallen Anselmo, and then he read the paper, the handwriting which he recognized as his, and which contained these words: "A fool and ill-advised desire has robbed me of life. If the news of my death should reach the ears of Camilla, let her know that I forgive her, for she was not bound to perform miracles, nor ought I to have required her to perform them, and since I have been the author of my own dishonour, there is no reason why—" So far Anselmo had written, and thus it was plain that at this point, before he could finish what he had to say, his life came to an end. The next day his friend sent intelligence of his death to his relatives, who had already ascertained his misfortune, as well as the convent where Camilla lay almost on the point of accompanying her husband to that inevitable journey, not on account of the tidings of his death, but because of those she received of her lover's departure. Although she saw herself a widow, it is said she refused either to quit the convent or to take the veil, until not long afterwards intelligence reached her that Lothario had been killed in a battle in which Monsieur de Lautrec had been recently engaged with the great Captain Gonzalo Fernande de Cordova in the kingdom of Naples, whither her too late repentant lover had repaired. On learning this, Camilla took the veil, and shortly afterwards died, worn out by grief and melancholy. This was the end of all three, an end that came of a thoughtless beginning. "I like this novel," said the curate, "but I cannot persuade myself of its truth, and it has been invented. The author's invention is faulty, for it is impossible to imagine any husband so foolish as to try such a costly experiment as Anselmo's. If it had been represented as occurring between a gallant and his mistress, it might pass, but between husband and wife there is something of an impossibility about it. As to the way in which the story is told, however, I have no fault to find. End of chapter 35. End of chapter 34 through 35. Don Quixote, Volume 1, by Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra, translated by John Ormsby. Chapters 36 through 38. Chapter 36, which treats of more curious incidents that occurred at the inn. Just at that instant the landlord, who was standing at the gate of the inn, exclaimed, "Here comes a fine troop of guests. If they stop here we may say, Gaudeamus." "What are they?" said Cardenio. "4 men," said the landlord, "riding a la gineta, with lances and bucklers, and all with black veils, and with them there is a woman in white, on a side saddle, whose face is also veiled, and 2 attendants on foot." "Are they very near?" said the curate. "So near," answered the lord, "that here they come." Hearing this, Dorothea covered her face, and Cardenio retreated into Don Quixote's room, and they hardly had time to do so before the whole party the host had described entered the inn, and the 4 that were on horseback, who were of high-bred appearance and bearing, dismounted and came forward to take down the woman who rode on the side saddle, and one of them, taking her in his arms, placed her in a chair that stood at the entrance of the room where Cardenio had hidden himself. All this time she nor they had removed their veils or spoken a word. Only on sitting down on the chair the woman gave a deep sigh and let her arms fall like one that was ill and weak. The attendants on foot then led the horses away to the stable. Observing this, the curate, curious to know who these people in such a dress and preserving silence were, went to where the servants were standing and put the question to one of them, and who answered him, "Faith, sir, I cannot tell you who they are. I only know they seem to be people of distinction, particularly he who advanced to take the lady you saw in his arms, and I say so because all the rest show him respect, and nothing is done except what he directs and orders." "And the lady, who is she?" asked the curate. "That I cannot tell you either," said the servant, "for I have neither seen her face all the way. I have indeed heard her sigh many times, and utter such groans that she seems to be giving up the ghost every time, but it is no wonder if we do not know more than we have told you, as my comrade and I have only been in their company 2 days. For having met us on the road, they begged and persuaded us to accompany them to Andalusia, promising to pay us well." "And have you heard any of them called by his name?" asked the curate. "No, indeed," replied the servant. "They all preserve a marvellous silence on the road, for not a sound is to be heard among them except the poor lady's sighs and sobs, which make us pity her, and we feel sure that wherever it is she is going it is against her will, and as far as one can judge from her dress she is a nun, or what is more likely, about to become one, and perhaps it is because taking the vows is not of her own free will that she is so unhappy as she seems to be." "That may well be," said the curate, and leaving them he returned to where Dorothea was, who, hearing the veiled lady sigh, moved by natural compassion, drew near to her and said, "What are you suffering from, señor? If it be anything that women are accustomed and know how to relieve, I offer you my services with all my heart." To this the unhappy lady made no reply, and Dorothea repeated her offers more earnestly, and still she kept silence, until the gentleman with the veil, who the servant said was obeyed by the rest, approached and said to Dorothea, "Do not give yourself the trouble, señor, of making any offers to that woman, for it is her way to give no thanks for anything that is done for her. And do not try to make her answer unless you want to hear some lie from her lips." "I have never told a lie," was the immediate reply of her who had been silent until now. "On the contrary, it is because I am so truthful and so ignorant of lying devices that I am now in this miserable condition, and this I call you yourself to witness, for it is my unstained truth that has made you false and a liar." Cardenio heard these words clearly and distinctly, being close to the speaker, for there was only the door of the Don Quixote's room between them, and the instant he did so, uttering a loud exclamation, he cried, "Good God, what is this I hear? What voice is this that has reached my ears?" Startled at the voice, the lady turned her head, and not seeing the speaker, she stood up and attempted to enter the room, observing which the gentleman held her back, preventing her from moving a step. In her agitated and sudden movement, the silk with which she had covered her face fell off and disclosed a countenance of incomparable and marvellous beauty, but pale and terrified, for she kept turning her eyes, and everywhere she could direct her gaze with an eagerness that made her look as if she had lost her senses, and so marked that it excited the pity of Dorothea, and all beheld her, though they knew not what caused it. The gentleman grasped her firmly by the shoulders, and being so fully occupied with holding her back, he was unable to put a hand to his veil, which was falling off, as it did at length entirely, and Dorothea, who was holding the lady in her arms, raised her eyes and saw that he who likewise held her was her husband, Don Fernando. The instant she recognized him, with a prolonged plaintive cry drew from the depths of her heart, she fell backwards fainting, and but for the barber being close by to catch her in his arms, she would have fallen completely to the ground. The curate at once hastened to uncover her face and throw water on it. As he did so, Don Fernando, for he it was who held the other in his arms, recognized her and stood as if death-stricken by the sight. Not, however, relaxing his grip of Luscinda, for it was she that was struggling to release himself from his hold, having recognized Cardenio by his voice as he had recognized her. Cardenio also heard Dorothea's cry as she fell fainting, and imagining that it came from his Luscinda, burst forth in terror from the room, and the first thing he saw was Don Fernando with Luscinda in his arms. Don Fernando too knew Cardenio at once, and all three, Luscinda, Cardenio, and Dorothea, stood in silent amazement, scarcely knowing what had happened to them. They gazed at one another without speaking, Dorothea at Don Fernando at Cardenio, Cardenio at Luscinda, and Luscinda at Cardenio. The first to break the silence was Luscinda, who thus addressed Don Fernando. "Leave me, Señor Don Fernando, for the sake of what you owe to yourself. If no other reason will induce you, leave me to cling to the wall of which I am the ivy, to the support from which neither your importunities, nor your threats, nor your promises, nor your gifts have been able to detach me. See how heaven, by ways strange and hidden from our sight, has brought me face to face with my true husband, and well you know by dear-bought experience that death alone will be able to efface him from my memory. May this plain declaration then lead you, as you can do nothing else, to turn your love into rage, your affection into resentment, and so to take my life, for if I yield it up in the presence of my beloved husband, I count it well bestowed. It may be by my death you will be convinced that I kept faith to him to the last moments of life." Meanwhile Dorothea had come to herself, and had heard Luscinda's words, by means of which she divined who she was, but seeing that Don Fernando did not yet release or reply to her, summoning up her resolution as well as she could, she rose and knelt at his feet, and with a flood of bright and touching tears addressed him thus: "If, my lord, the beams of that sun that thou holdest eclipsed in thine arms did not dazzle and rob thine eyes of sight, thou wouldst have seen by this time that she who kneels at thy feet is, so long as thou wilt have it, so the unhappy and unfortunate Dorothea. I am that lowly peasant girl whom in thy goodness or for thy pleasure wouldst raise high enough to call herself thine. I am she who in the seclusion of innocence led a contented life until at the voice of thy importunity and thy true and tender passion, as it seemed, she opened the gates of her modesty and surrendered to thee the keys of her liberty, a gift received by thee but thanklessly, as it is shown by my forced retreat to the place where thou dost find me, and by thy appearance under the circumstance in which I see thee. Nevertheless, I would not have thee suppose that I have come here driven by my shame. It is only grief and sorrow at seeing myself forgotten by thee that have led me. It was thy will to make me thine, and thou didst so follow thy will, and that now, even thou repentest, thou canst not help being mine. Bethink thee, my lord, the insurpassable affection I bear thee may compensate for the beauty and noble birth for which thou wouldst desert me. Thou canst not be the fair Luscinda's because thou art mine, nor can she be thine because she is Cardenio's, and it will be easier, remember, to bend thy will to love one who adores thee, than to lead one to love thee who abhors thee now. Thou didst address thyself to my simplicity, thou didst lay siege to my virtue, thou wert not ignorant of my station. Well dost thou know how I yielded wholly to thy will. There is no ground or reason for thee to plead deception. And if it be so, as it is, and if thou art a Christian as thou art a gentleman, why dost thou by such subterfuges put off making me as happy at last as thou didst at first? And if thou wilt not have me for what I am, thy true and lawful wife, at least take and accept me as thy slave, for so long as I am thine I will count myself happy and fortunate. Do not by deserting me let my shame become the talk of the gossips in the street. Make not the old age of my parents miserable, for the loyal services they, as faithful vassals, have ever rendered thine, are not deserving of such a return, and if thou thinkest it will debase thy blood to mingle with mine, reflect that there is little or no nobility in the world that has not travelled in the same road, and that in illustrious lineages it is not the woman's blood that is of account, and moreover that true nobility consists in virtue, and if thou art wanting in that, refusing me what in justice thou owest me, then even I have higher claims to nobility than thine. To make an end, señor, these are my last words to thee, whether thou wilt or wilt not. I am thy wife. Witness thy words, which must not and ought not to be false. If thou dost pride thyself on what for want of which thou scornest me, Witness the pledge which thou didst give me, and witness heaven, which thou thyself didst call to witness the promise thou hadst made me. And if all this fail, my own conscience will not fail to lift up its silent voice in the midst of all thy gaiety, and vindicate the truth of what I say, and mar thy highest pleasure and enjoyment." All this and more the injured Dorothea delivered with such earnest feeling and such tears that all present, even those who came with Don Fernando, were constrained to join her in them. Don Fernando listened to her without replying, until, ceasing to speak, she gave way to such sobs and sighs that it must have been a heart of brass that was not softened by the sight of so great sorrow. Luscinda stood regarding her with no less compassion for her sufferings than admiration for her intelligence and beauty, and would have gone to her to say some words of comfort to her, but was prevented by Don Fernando's grasp, which held her fast. He, overwhelmed with confusion and astonishment, after regarding Dorothea for some moments with a fixed gaze, opened his arms, and releasing Luscinda, exclaimed, "Thou hast conquered, fair Dorothea, thou hast conquered, for it is impossible to have the heart to deny the united force of so many truths." Luscinda in her feebleness was on the point of falling to the ground when Don Fernando released her, but Cardenio, who stood near, having retreated behind Don Fernando to escape recognition, casting aside fear and regardless of what might happen, ran forward to support her, and said as he clasped her in his arms, "If heaven in its compassion is willing to let thee rest at last, mistress of my heart, true, constant, and fair, nowhere canst thou rest more safely than in these arms that now receive thee, and received thee before when fortune permitted me to call thee mine." At these words Luscinda looked up at Cardenio, at first beginning to recognize him by his voice, and then satisfying herself by her eyes that it was he, and hardly knowing what she did, and heedless of all considerations of decorum, she flung her arms around his neck, and pressing her place close to his, said, "Yes, my dear lord, you are the true master of this your slave, and even though adverse fate interpose again, and fresh dangers threaten this life that hangs on yours." A strange sight was this for Don Fernando and those that stood around, filled with surprise at an incident so unlooked for. Dorothea fancied that Don Fernando changed colour and looked as though he meant to take vengeance on Cardenio, for she observed him put his hand to his sword, and the instant the idea struck her, with wonderful quickness she clasped him round the knees, and kissing them and holding him so as to prevent his moving, she said, while her tears continued to flow, "What is it thou wouldst do, my only refuge in this unforeseen event? Thou hast thy wife at thy feet, and she whom thou wouldst have for thy wife is in the arms of her husband. Reflect whether it will be right for thee, whether it will be possible for thee to undo what heaven has done, or whether it will be becoming in thee to seek to raise her to be thy mate, who in spite of every obstacle, and strong in her truth and constancy, is before thine eyes, bathing with the tears of love the face and bosom of her lawful husband. For God's sake I entreat of thee, for thine own I implore thee, let not this open manifestation rouse thy anger, but rather so calm it as to allow these two lovers to live in peace and quiet without any interference from thee so long as heaven permits them, and in so doing thou wilt prove the generosity of thy lofty noble spirit, and the world shall see with thee reason has more influence than passion." All the time Dorothea was speaking, Cardenio, though he held Luscinda in his arms, never took his eyes off Don Fernando, determined, if he saw him make any hostile movement, to try and defend himself, and resist as best he could all who might assail him, though it should cost him his life. But now Don Fernando's friends, as well as the curate and the barber, who had been present all the while, not forgetting the worthy Sancho Panza, ran forward and gathered round Don Fernando, entreating him to have regard for the tears of Dorothea, and not suffer her reasonable hopes to be disappointed, since, as they firmly believed what she said was the truth, and bidding him observe that it was not, as it might seem by accident, but a special disposition of Providence that they had all met in a place where no one could have expected a meeting. And the curate bade him remember that only death could part Luscinda from Cardenio, and even if some sword were to separate them, they would think their death most happy, and that in a case that admitted of no remedy his wisest course was, by conquering and putting a constraint upon himself, to show a generous mind, and of his own accord suffer these two to enjoy the happiness heaven had granted them. He bade him, too, turn his eyes upon the beauty of Dorothea, and he would see that few, if any, could equal, much less excel her, while to that beauty should be added her modesty and the surpassing love she bore him. But besides all this, he reminded him that if he prided himself on being a gentleman and a Christian, he could not do otherwise than keep his plighted word, and that in doing so he would obey God and meet the approval of all sensible people who know and recognize it to be the privilege of beauty, even in one of humble birth, provided virtue accompany it, to be able to raise herself to the level of any rank, without any slur upon him who places it upon an equality with himself, and furthermore, that when the potent sway of passion asserts itself, so long as there be no mixture of sin in it, he is not to be blamed who gives way to it. To be brief, they added to these such other forcible arguments that Don Fernando's manly heart, being after all nourished by noble blood, was touched, and yielded to the truth which, even had he wished it, he could not gainsay. And he showed his submission and acceptance of the good advice that had been offered him, by stooping down and embracing Dorothea, saying to her, "Rise, dear lady, it is not right that what I hold in my heart should be kneeling at my feet, and if until now I have shown no sign of what I own, it may have been by heaven's decree, in order that, seeing the constancy with which you love me, I may learn to value you as you deserve. What I entreat of you is that you reproach me not with my transgression and grievous wrongdoing, for the same cause and force that drove me to make you mine impelled me to struggle against being yours, and to prove this, turn and look at the eyes of the now happy Lucinda, and you will see in them an excuse for all my errors, and as she has found and gained the object of her desires, and I have found in you what satisfies all my wishes, may she live in peace and contentment and as many happy years with her Cardenio, as on my knees I pray heaven to allow me to live with my Dorothea." And with these words he once more embraced her and pressed his face to hers with so much tenderness that he had to take great heed to keep his tears from completing the proof of his love and repentance in the sight of all. Not so Lucinda and Cardenio, and almost all the others, for they shed so many tears, some in their own happiness, some at that of the others, that one would have supposed a heavy calamity had fallen upon them all. Even Sancho Panza was weeping, though afterwards he said he only wept because he saw that Dorothea was not as he fancied the Queen Comicona, of whom he had expected such great favours. Their wonder, as well as their weeping, lasted some time, and then Cardenio and Lucinda went on and fell on their knees before Don Fernando, returning him thanks for the favour he had rendered them in language so grateful that he knew not how to answer them, and raising them up embraced them with every mark of affection and courtesy. He then asked Dorothea how she managed to reach a place so far removed from her own home, and she, in a few fitting words, told all that she had previously related to Cardenio, with which Don Fernando and his companions were so delighted that they wished the story had been longer, so charmingly did Dorothea describe her misadventures. When she had finished, Don Fernando recounted what had befallen him in the city after he had found Lucinda's bosom the paper in which she declared that she was Cardenio's wife, and could never be his. He said he meant to kill her, and would have done so had he not been prevented by her parents, and that he quitted the house full of rage and shame, and resolved to avenge himself when a more convenient opportunity should offer. The next day he learned that Lucinda had disappeared from her father's house, and that no one could tell whither she had gone. Finally, at the end of some months, he ascertained that she was in a convent, and meant to remain there all the rest of her life if she were not to share it with Cardenio. And as soon as he had learned this, taking these 3 gentlemen as his companions, he arrived at the place where she was, but avoided speaking to her, fearing that if it were known he was there, stricter precautions would be taken in the convent, and watching a time when the porter's lodge was open, he left 2 to guard the gate, and he and the other entered the convent in quest of Lucinda, whom they found in the cloisters in conversation with one of the nuns, and carrying her off without giving her time to resist, they reached a place with her where they provided themselves with what they required for taking her away, all which they were able to do in complete safety, as the convent was in the country at a considerable distance from the city. He added that when Lucinda found herself in his power, she lost all consciousness, and after returning to herself did nothing but weep and sigh without speaking a word. And thus in silence and tears they had reached that inn, which for him was reaching heaven, where all the mischances of earth are over and at an end. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37, in which is continued the story of the famous Princess Micomicona, with other droll adventures. To all this Sancho listened with no little sorrow at heart to see how his hopes of dignity were fading away and vanishing in smoke, and how the fair Princess Micomicona had turned into Dorothea, and the giant into Don Fernando, while his master was sleeping tranquilly, totally unconscious of all that had come to pass. Dorothea was unable to persuade herself that her present happiness was not all a dream. Cardenio was in a similar state of mind, and Lucinda's thoughts ran in the same direction. Don Fernando gave thanks to heaven for the favour shown him, and for having been rescued from the intricate labyrinth in which he had been brought so near to the destruction of his good name and of his soul. And in short, everybody at the inn was full of contentment and satisfaction at the happy issue of such a complicated and hopeless business. The curate, as a sensible man, made sound reflections upon the whole affair, and congratulated each upon his good fortune. But the one that was in the highest spirits and good humour was the landlady, because of the promise Cardenio and the curate had given her, to pay for all the losses and damage she had sustained through Don Quixote's means. Sancho, as has already been said, was the only one who was distressed, unhappy, and dejected. And so with a long face he went in to his master, who had just awoke, and said to him, "Sir Rueful Countenance, your worship may as well sleep on as much as you like without troubling yourself about killing any giant or restoring her kingdom to the princess, for that is all over and settled now." "I should think it was," replied Don Quixote, "for I have had the most prodigious and stupendous battle with the giant that I ever remember having at all the days of my life, and with one back stroke, swish, I brought his head tumbling to the ground, and so much blood gushed forth from him that it ran in rivulets over the earth like water." "Like red wine, your worship had better say," replied Sancho, "for I would have you know, if you don't know it, that the dead giant is a hacked wineskin, and the blood 24 gallons of red wine that it had in its belly, and the cut off head is the bitch that bore me, and the devil take it all." "What art thou talking about, fool?" said Don Quixote. "Art thou in thy senses?" "Let your worship get up," said Sancho, "and you will see the nice business you have made of it, and what we have to pay, and you will see the queen turned into the private lady called Dorothea, and other things that will astonish you if you understand them." "I shall not be surprised at anything of the kind," returned Don Quixote, "for if thou dost remember, the last time we were here I told thee that everything that happened here was a matter of enchantment, and it would be no wonder if it were the same now." "I could believe all that," replied Sancho, "if my blanketing was the same sort of thing also, only it wasn't, but real and genuine, for I saw the landlord, who was here today, holding one end of the blanket and jerking me up to the skies very neatly and smartly, and with as much laughter and strength. And when it comes to be a cause of knowing people, I hold for my part, simple and sinner as I am, that there is no enchantment about it at all, but a great deal of bruising and bad luck." "Well, well, God will give a remedy," said Don Quixote. "Hand me my clothes and let me go out, for I want to see these transformations and things thou speakest of." Sancho fetched him his clothes, and while he was dressing, the curate gave Don Fernando and the others present an account of Don Quixote's madness and of the stratagem they had made use of to withdraw him from that pena pobre where he fancied himself stationed because of his lady's scorn. He described to them also nearly all the adventures that Sancho had mentioned, at which they marvelled and laughed not a little, thinking it, as all did, the strangest form of madness that crazy intellect could be capable of. But now the curate said that the Lady Dorothea's good fortune prevented her from proceeding with their purpose. It would be necessary to devise or discover some other way of getting him home. Cardenio proposed to carry out the scheme they had begun, and suggested that Luscinda would act and support Dorothea's part sufficiently well. "No," said Don Fernando, "that must not be, for I want Dorothea to follow out this idea of hers, and if the worthy gentleman's village is not very far off, I shall be happy if I can do anything for his relief." "It is not more than 2 days' journey from this," said the curate. "Even if it were more," said Don Fernando, "I would gladly travel so far for the sake of doing so good a work." At this moment Don Quixote came out in full panoply, with Mambrino's helmet, all dinted as it was, on his head, his buckler on his arm, and leaning on his staff or pike. The strange figure he presented filled Don Fernando and the rest with amazement as they contemplated his lean yellow face, half a league long, his armour of all sorts, and the solemnity of his deportment. They stood silent, waiting to see what he would say, and he, fixing his eyes on the fair Dorothea, addressed her with great gravity and composure. "I am informed, fair lady, by my squire here, that your greatness has been annihilated and your being abolished, since from a queen and lady of high degree, as you used to be, you have been turned into a private maiden. If this has been done by the command of the magician king your father, the fear that I should not afford you the aid you need and are entitled to, I may tell you he did not know, and does not know, half the mass, and was little versed in the annals of chivalry. For if he had read and gone through them as attentively and deliberately as I have, he would have found at every turn that knights of less renown than mine have accomplished things more difficult. It is no great matter to kill a whelp of a giant, however arrogant he may be, for it is not many hours since I myself was engaged with one, and I will not speak of it, that they may not say I am lying. Time, however, that reveals all, will tell the tale when we least expect it." "You were engaged with a couple of wineskins and not a giant," said the landlord at this. But Don Fernando told him to hold his tongue and on no account interrupt Don Quixote, who continued, "I say in conclusion, high and disinherited lady, that if your father had brought about this metamorphosis in your person for the reason I have mentioned, you ought not attach any importance to it, for there is no peril on earth through which my sword will not force a way, and with it, before many days are over, I will bring your enemy's head to the ground, and place on yours the crown of your kingdom." Don Quixote said no more, and waited for the reply of the princess, who, aware of Don Fernando's determination to carry on the deception until Don Quixote had been conveyed to his home, with great ease of manner and gravity made answer, "Whoever told you, valiant knight of the rueful countenance, that I had undergone any change of transformation did not tell you the truth, for I am the same as I was yesterday. It is true that certain strokes of good fortune that have given me more than I could have hoped for have made some alteration in me, but I have not therefore ceased to be what I was before, or to entertain the same desire I have had all through of availing myself of the might of your valiant and invincible arm. And so, señor, let your goodness reinstate the father that begot me in your good opinion, and be assured that he was a wise and prudent man, since by his craft he found out such a sure and easy way of remedying my misfortune, for I believe, señor, that had it not been for you I should never have lit upon the good fortune I now possess. And in this I am saying what is perfectly true, as most of these gentlemen who are present can fully testify. All that remains is to set out on our journey tomorrow, for today we could not make much way, and for the rest of the happy result I am looking forward to, I trust to God and the valour of your heart." So said the sprightly Dorothea, and on hearing her Don Quixote returned to Sancho, and said to him with an angry air, "I declare now, little Sancho, thou art the greatest little villain in Spain. Say, thief and vagabond, hast thou not just told me that this princess had been turned into a maiden called Dorothea, and that the head which I am persuaded I cut off from a giant was the bitch that bore thee, and other nonsense that put me in the greatest perplexity I have ever been in all my life? I vow," and here he looked to heaven and ground his teeth, "I have a mind to play the mischief with thee in a way that will teach sense for the future to all lying squires of knight-errants in the world." "Let your worship be calm, señor," returned Sancho, "for it may well be that I have been mistaken as to the change of the lady princess my Comona, but as to the giant's head, or at least to the piercing of the wineskins and the blood being red wine, I make no mistake, as sure as there is a God, because the wounded skins are there at the head of your worship's bed, and the wine has made a lake of the room. If not, you will see when the eggs come to be fried. I mean when his worship the landlord calls for all the damages. For the rest, I am heartily glad that her ladyship is the queen as she was, for it concerns me as much as anyone." "I tell thee again, Sancho, thou art a fool," said Don Quixote. "Forgive me, and that will do." "That will do," said Don Fernando. "Let us say no more about it, and as her ladyship the princess proposes to set out tomorrow because it is too late today, so be it, and we will pass the night in a pleasant conversation, and tomorrow we will all accompany Señor Don Quixote, for we wish to witness the valiant and unparalleled achievements he is about to perform in the course of his mighty enterprise which he has undertaken." "It is I who shall wait upon and accompany you," said Don Quixote, "and I am much gratified with the favour that is bestowed upon me and the good opinion entertained of me, which I shall strive to justify, or it shall cost me my life, or even more, if it can possibly cost me more." Many were the compliments and expressions of politeness that passed between Don Quixote and Don Fernando, but they were brought to an end by a traveller who at this moment entered the inn, and who seemed from his attire to be a Christian lately come from the country of the Moors, for he was dressed in a short-skirted coat of blue cloth with half sleeves and without a collar. His breeches were also of blue cloth, and his hat of the same colour, and he wore yellow buckskins and had a Moorish cutlass slung from a baldric across his breast. Behind him, mounted upon an ass, there came a woman dressed in Moorish fashion, with her face veiled and a scarf on her head, and wearing a little brocaded cap and a mantle that covered her from her shoulders to feet. The man was of a robust and well-proportioned frame, in age a little over 40, rather swarthy in complexion, with long moustache and a full beard, and in short, his appearance was such that if he had been well dressed he would have been taken for a person of quality and good birth. On entering he asked for a room, and when they told him there was none in the inn, he seemed distressed, and approaching her by her dress seemed to be more, he took her down from the saddle in his arms. Luscinda Dorothea, the landlady, her daughter and Maritornes, attracted by the strange and to them entirely new costume, gathered round her, and Dorothea, who was always kindly, courteous, and quick-witted, perceiving that both she and the man who had brought her were annoyed at not finding a room, said to her, "Do not be put out, señor, by the discomfort and want of luxuries here, for it is the way of roadside inns to be without them. Still, if you will be pleased to share our lodging with us," pointing to Luscinda, "perhaps you will have found worse accommodation in the course of your journey." To this the veiled lady made no reply. All she did was to rise from her seat, crossing her hands upon her bosom, bowing her head and bending her body as a sign that she returned thanks. From her silence she concluded that she must be a Moor and unable to speak a Christian tongue. At this moment the captive came up, having been until now otherwise engaged, and seeing that they all stood around his companion, that she made no reply to what they addressed to her, he said, "Ladies, this damsel hardly understands my language, and can speak none but that of her own country, for which reason she does not and cannot answer what has been asked of her." "Nothing has been asked of her," returned Luscinda. "She has only been offered our company for this evening, and a share of the quarters we occupy, where she shall be made as comfortable as the circumstances allow. With the good will we are bound to show all strangers that stand in need of it, especially if it be a woman to whom the service is rendered." "On her part and my own, señora," replied the captive, "I kiss your hands, and I esteem highly, as I ought, the favour you have offered, which on such an occasion, and coming from persons of your appearance, is plain to see is a very great one." "Tell me, señora," said Dorothea, "is this lady a Christian or a Moor? For her dress and her silence leads us to imagine that she is what we could wish she was not." "In dress and outwardly," said he, "she is a Moor, but at heart she is thoroughly good Christian, for she has the greatest desire to become one." "Then she has not been baptized," returned Luscinda. "There has been no opportunity for that," replied the captive. "Since she left Algiers, her native country and home, and up to the present she has not found herself in any such imminent danger of death as to make it necessary to baptize her before she has been instructed in all the ceremonies our Holy Mother Church ordains. But, please God, ere long she shall be baptized with a solemnity befitting her, which is higher than her dress or mine indicates." By these words he excited a desire in all who heard him to know who the Moorish lady and the captive were, but no one liked to ask just then, seeing that it was a fitter moment for helping them to rest themselves than for questioning them about their lives. Dorothea took the Moorish lady by the hand, and leading her to a seat beside herself, requested her to remove her veil. She looked at the captive as if to ask him what they meant and what she was to do. He said to her in Arabic that they asked her to take off her veil, and thereupon she removed it, and disclosed a countenance so lovely that to Dorothea she seemed more beautiful than Luscinda, and to Luscinda more beautiful than Dorothea, and all the bystanders felt that if any beauty could compare with theirs it was the Moorish lady's, and there were even those who were inclined to give it somewhat the preference. And as it is the privilege and charm of beauty to win the heart and secure goodwill, all forthwith became eager to show kindness and attention to the lovely Moor. Don Fernando asked the captive what her name was, and he replied that it was Lela Zoraida, but the instant she heard him she guessed what the Christian had asked, and said hastily with some displeasure and energy, "No, not Zoraida, Maria, Maria," giving them to understand that she was called Maria and not Zoraida. These words, touching earnestness with which she uttered them, drew more than one tear from some of the listeners, particularly the women, who are by nature tender-hearted and compassionate. Luscinda embraced her affectionately, saying, "Yes, yes, Maria, Maria," to which the Moor replied, "Yes, yes, Maria, Zoraida Mencanje," which means, "not Zoraida." Night was now approaching, and by the orders of those who accompanied Don Fernando, the landlord had taken care and pains to prepare for them the best supper that was in his power. The hour therefore having arrived, they all took their seats at a long table like a refectory one, for round or square table there was none in the inn, and the seat of honour at the head of it, though he was refusing it, they assigned to Don Quixote, who desired the lady Micomicona to place herself by his side, as he was her protector. Luscinda and Zoraida took their places next to her. Opposite them were Don Fernando and Cardenio, next the captive and the other gentlemen, and by the side of the ladies the curate and the barber. And so they supped in high enjoyment, which was increased when they observed Don Quixote leaving off eating, and moved by an impulse like that which made him deliver himself at such lengths when he supposed with the goatherds, began to address them. "Verily, gentlemen, if we reflect upon it, great and marvellous are the things they see, who make profession of the order of knight-errantry. Say, what being is there in this world, who entering the gate of this castle at this moment, and seeing us as we are here, would suppose or imagine us to be what we are? Who would say that this lady who is beside me was the great queen that we all know her to be, or that I am the knight of the rueful countenance, trumpeted far and wide by the mouth of fame? Now, there can be no doubt that this art and calling surpasses all those that mankind has invented, and is the more deserving of being held in honour in proportion as it is the more exposed to peril. Away with those who assert that letters have the preeminence over arms. I will tell them, whosoever they may be, that they know not what they say, for the reason which such persons commonly assign, and upon which they chiefly rest, is, that the labours of the mind are greater than those of the body, and that the arms give employment to the body alone, as if the calling were a porter's trade, for which nothing is more required than sturdy strength, or as if we who profess to call them arms, there were not included acts of vigour for the execution of which high intelligence is requisite, or as if it were the soul of the warrior, then he has an army or the defence of a city under his care, did not exert itself as much by mind as by body. Nay, see whether by bodily strength it be possible to learn or divine the intentions of the enemy, his plans, stratagems, or obstacles, or to ward off impending mischief. For all these are the work of the mind, and in them the body has no share whatsoever. Since, therefore, arms have need of the mind as much as letters, let us see now which of the two minds, that of the man of letters or that of the warrior, has most to do. And this will be seen by the end and goal that each seeks to attain, for that purpose is the more estimable which has for its aim the nobler object. The end and goal of letters, I am not speaking now of divine letters, the aim of which is to raise and direct the soul to heaven, for which an end so infinite no other can be compared. I speak of human letters, the end of which is to establish distributive justice, to give every man that which is his, and to see and take care that good laws are observed, and undoubtedly noble, lofty, and deserving of high praise, but not such as should be given to that sought by arms, which have for their end and object peace, the greatest boon that men can desire in this life. The first news the world and mankind received was that which the angels announced on the night that was our day, and they sang in the air, "Glory to God in the highest, and peace on earth to men of good will." And the salutation which the great Master of heaven and earth taught his disciples and chosen followers when they entered any house was to say, "Peace be on this house." And many other times he said to them, "My peace I give unto you, my peace I leave you, peace be with you." A jewel and precious gift given and left by such a hand, a jewel without which there can be no happiness either on heaven or in earth. This peace is the true end of war, and war is only another name for arms. This, then, being admitted that the end of war is peace, and that so far it has the advantages of the end of letters, let us turn to the bodily labours of the man of letters, and those of him who follows the profession of arms, and see which are the greater. Don Quixote delivered his discourse in such a manner and in such correct language that, for the time being, he made it impossible for any of his hearers to consider him a madman. On the contrary, as they were mostly gentlemen, to whom arms are an appurtenance by birth, they listened to him with greatest pleasure as he continued. "Here, then, I say, is what the student has to undergo. First of all, poverty. Not that all are poor, but to put the case as strongly as possible. And when I have said that he endures poverty, I think nothing more need to be said about his hard fortune, for he who is poor has no share of the good things of life. This poverty he suffers from in various ways, hunger or cold or nakedness or altogether, but for all that it's not so extreme but that he gets something to eat, though it may be at somewhat unseasonable hours and from the leavings of the rich. For the greatest misery of the student is that which they themselves call going out for soup, and there is always some neighbour's brazier or hearth for them, which if it does not warm, at least tempers the cold to them. And lastly, they sleep comfortably at night under a roof. I will not go into other particulars, as for example want of shirts, and no superabundance of shoes, thin and threadbare garments, and gorging themselves to surfeit their voracity when good luck has treated them to a banquet of some sort. By this road that I've described, rough and hard, stumbling here, falling there, getting up again to fall again, they reach the rank they desire, and that once attained, we have seen many who pass these Certes and Scyllas and Charbidiuses, as if borne flying on the wings of favouring fortune. We have seen them, I say, ruling and governing the world from a chair, their hunger turned into satiety, their cold into comfort, their nakedness into fine raiment, their sleep on a mat into repose, and Holland into damask. the justly earned reward of their virtue, but contrasted and compared with that which the warrior undergoes, all they have undergone falls far short of it, as I am now about to show. End of chapter 37. Chapter 38, which treats of the curious discourse Don Quixote delivered on arms and letters. Continuing his discourse, Don Quixote said, "As we began in the student's case with poverty and its accompaniments, let us see now if the soldier is richer, and we shall find that in poverty there is no one poorer, for he is dependent on his miserable pay, which comes late or never, or else on what he can plunder, seriously imperiling his life and conscience, and sometimes his nakedness will be so great that a slashed doublet serves him for uniform and shirt, and in the depth of winter he has to defend himself against the inclemency of the weather in the open field, with nothing better than the breath of his mouth, which I need not say, coming from an empty place, must come out cold, contrary to the laws of nature. Be sure he looks forward to the approach of night to make up for all of these discomforts on the bed that awaits him, which, unless by some fault of his, never sins by being over narrow, for he can easily measure out on the ground as he likes, and rolling himself about on it to his heart's content without any fear of the sheet slipping away from him. Then, after all this, suppose the day and hour for taking his degree and his calling to have come. Suppose the day of battle to have arrived, when they invest him with a doctor's cap made of lint to mend some bullet hole, perhaps, that has gone through his temples, or left him with a crippled leg or arm. Or if this does not happen, and merciful heaven watches over him, and keeps him safe and sound, it may be he will be in the same poverty he was in before, and he must go through more engagements and more battles, and come victorious out of all before he betters himself. But miracles of that sort are seldom seen. For tell me, sirs, if you have ever reflected upon it, by how much do those who have gained by war fall short of the number of those who have perished in it? No doubt you will reply that there can be no comparison, that the dead cannot be numbered, while the living who have been rewarded may be summed up with 3 figures, all which is the reverse in the case of men of letters, for by skirts, say nothing of sleeves, they all find means of support, so that though the soldier has more to endure, his reward is less. But against all this it may be urged that it is easier to reward 2,000 soldiers, for the former may be remunerated by giving them places, which must perforce be conferred upon men of their calling, while the latter can only be compensated out of the way of the very property of the master they serve. But this impossibility only strengthens my argument. Putting this, however, aside, for it is a puzzling question for which it is difficult to find a solution, let us return to the superiority of arms over letters, a matter still undecided. So many are the arguments put forward on each side, for that besides those I have mentioned, letters say that without them arms cannot maintain themselves. For war too has its laws and is governed by them, and laws belong to the domain of letters and men of letters. To this arms make answer that without them laws cannot be maintained. For by arms states are defended, kingdoms preserved, cities protected, roads made safe, seas cleared of pirates, and in short, if it were not for them, states, kingdoms, monarchies, cities, ways by sea and land would be exposed to the violence and confusion which war brings it, so long as it lasts and is free to make use of its privileges and powers. And then it is plain that whatever costs most is valued and deserves to be valued most. To attain to eminence in letters costs a man time, watching hunger, nakedness, headaches, indigestions, and other things of the sorts, some of which I have already referred to. But for a man to come in the ordinary course of things to be a good soldier, it costs him all the student suffers, and in an incomparably higher degree. For at each step he runs the risk of losing his life. For what dread of want or poverty that can reach or harass the student can compare with what the soldier feels who finds himself beleaguered in some stronghold, mounting guard in some ravelin or cavalier, knows that the enemy is pushing a mine towards the post where he is stationed, and cannot under any circumstances retire or fly from the imminent danger that threatens him. All he can do is inform his captain of what is going on, so that he may try to remedy it by a countermine, and then stand his ground in fear and expectation of the moment when he will fly up to the clouds without wings and descend into the deep against his will. And if this seems a trifling task, let us see whether it is equalled or surpassed by the encounter of 2 galleys stem to stem in the midst of the open sea, locked and entangled one with the other, when the soldier has no more standing room than the 2 feet of plank in the burr, and yet, though he sees before him threatening as many ministers of death as there are cannon of the foe pointed at him, not a lance length from his body, and sees that with the first heedless step he will go down to visit the profundities of Neptune's bosom. So with dauntless heart, urged on by honour that nerves him, he makes himself a target for all that musketry, and struggles to cross that narrow path to the enemy's ship. And what is still more marvellous, no sooner has one gone down into the depths he will never rise from till the end of the world, then another takes his place, and if he too falls into the sea that waits for him like an enemy, another and another will succeed him, without a moment's pause between their deaths, courage and daring the greatest that all the chances of war can show. Happy the blessed ages that knew not the dread fury of these devilish engines of artillery, whose inventor, I am persuaded, is in hell, receiving the reward of his diabolical invention, by which he made it easy for a base and cowardly arm to take the life of a gallant gentleman, and that, when he knows not how or whence, in the height of the ardour and enthusiasm that fire and animate brave hearts, there should come some random bullet, discharged perhaps by one who fled in terror at the flash when he fired off his accursed machine, when in an instant puts an end to the projects and cuts off the life of one who deserved to live for ages to come. And thus, when I reflect on this, I am almost tempted to say that in my heart I repent of having adopted this profession of knight-errant in so detestable an age as we live in now. For though no peril can make me fear, still it gives me some uneasiness to think that powder and lead may rob me of the opportunity of making myself famous and renowned throughout the known earth by the might of my arm and the edge of my sword. But heaven's will be done. If I succeed in my attempt, I shall be all the more honoured, as I have faced greater dangers than the knight-errants of yore exposed themselves to. All this lengthy discourse Don Quixote delivered while the others supped, forgetting to raise a morsel to his lips, though Sancho more than once told him to eat his supper, as he would have time enough afterwards to say all he wanted. It excited fresh pity in those who had heard him to see a man of apparently sound sense, and with rational views on every subject he discussed, so hopelessly wanting in all when his wretched, unlucky chivalry was in question. The curate told him he was quite right in all he had said in favour of arms, and that he himself, though a man of letters and a graduate, was of the same opinion. They finished their supper, the cloth was removed, and while the hostess, her daughter, and Maritornes were getting Don Quixote of La Mancha's garret ready, in which it was arranged that the women were to be quartered by themselves for the night, Don Fernando begged the captive to tell them the story of his life, for it could not fail to be strange and interesting, to judge by the hints he had let fall on his arrival in company with Zoraida. To this the captive replied that he would very willingly yield to his request, only he feared his tale would not give them as much pleasure as he wished. Nevertheless, not to be wanting in compliance, he would tell it. The curate and the others thanked him, and added their entreaties, and he, finding himself so pressed, said there was no occasion to ask where a command had such weight, and added, "If your worships will give your attention, you will hear a true story, which, perhaps, fictitious ones constructed with ingenious and studied art cannot come up to." These words made them settle themselves in their places, and preserve a deep silence, and he, seeing them waiting on his words, in mute expectation, began thus in a pleasant, quiet voice. End of chapter 38. End of chapters 36 through 38. Don Quixote, Volume 1, by Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra, translated by John Ormsby. Chapters 39 through 40. Chapter 39, wherein the captive relates his life and adventures. My family had its origin in a village in the mountains of Leon, and nature has been kinder and more generous to it than fortune, though in the general poverty of those communities my father passed for being even a rich man, and he would have been so in reality had he been as clever in preserving his property as he was in spending it. This tendency of his to be liberal and profuse he had acquired from having been a soldier in his youth, for the soldier's life is a school in which the niggard becomes free-handed and the free-handed prodigal, and if any soldiers are to be found who are misers, they are monsters of rare occurrence. My father went beyond liberality, and bordered on prodigality, and a disposition by no means advantageous to a married man who has children to succeed his name and position. My father had 3, all sons, and all of sufficient age to make choice of a profession. Finding that he was unable to resist his propensity, he resolved to divest himself of the instrument and cause of his prodigality and lavishness, to divest himself of wealth, without which Alexander himself would have seemed parsimonious, and so, calling us all 3 aside one day into a room, he addressed us in words somewhat to the following effect. My sons, to ensure you that I love you, no more need be known or said than that you are my sons, and to encourage a suspicion that I do not love you, no more is needed than the knowledge that I have no self-control as far as preservation of your patrimony is concerned. Therefore, that you may for the future feel sure that I love you like a father, and have no wish to ruin you like a stepfather, I propose to do with you what I have for some time back meditated, and after mature deliberation decided upon. You are now of an age to choose your line of life, or at least to make choice of a calling that will bring you honour and profit when you are older. And what I have resolved to do is divide my property into 4 parts. 3 I will give to you, to each his portion without making any difference, and the other I will retain to live upon and support myself for whatever remainder of life Heaven may be pleased to grant me. But I wish each of you, on taking possession of that share that falls to him,
to follow one of the paths I shall indicate. In this Spain of ours there is a proverb, to my mind very true, as they all are, being short aphorisms drawn from long practical experience.
The one I refer to says, the church, or the sea, or the king's house, as much as to say, in plainer language, whoever wants to flourish and become rich, let him follow the church or go to sea, adopting commerce as his calling, or go into the king's service in his household, for they say, better a king's crumb than a lord's favour. I say so because it is my will and pleasure that one of you should follow letters, another trade, and the third serve the king in the wars, for it is a difficult matter to gain admission to his service and in his household, and if war does not bring much wealth, it confers great distinction and fame. 8 days hence I will give you your full shares in money, without defrauding you of a farthing, as you will see in the end. Now, tell me if you are willing to follow out my idea and advice as I have laid it before you. Having called upon me as the eldest to answer, I, after urging him not to strip himself of his property, but to spend it all as he pleased, we were young men able to gain our living, consented to comply with his wishes, and said that mine were to follow the profession of arms, and thereby serve God and my king. My second brother, having made the same proposal, decided upon going to the Indies, embarking the portion that fell to him in trade. The youngest, and in my opinion the wisest, said he would rather follow the church, or go to complete his studies at Salamanca. As soon as we had come to an understanding and made choice of our professions, my father embraced us all, and in the short time he mentioned, carried into effect all he had promised, and when he had given to each a share, which as well as I remember was 3,000 ducks apiece in cash, for an uncle of ours bought the estate and paid for it down, not to let it go out of the family. We all 3 on the same day took leave of our good father, and at the same time, as it seemed to me inhuman to leave my father with such scanty means in his old age, I induced him to take 2 of my 3,000 ducats, as the remainder would be enough to provide me with all a soldier needed. My 2 brothers, moved by my example, gave him each 1,000 ducats, so that there was left for my father 4,000 ducats of money, besides 3,000, the value of the portion that fell to him, which he preferred to retain in land instead of selling it. Finally, as I said, we took leave of him, and our uncle whom I have mentioned, not without sorrow and tears on both sides, they charging us to let them know, whenever an opportunity offered, how we fared, whether well or ill. We promised to do so, and when he had embraced us and given us his blessing, one set out for Salamanca, the other for Seville, and I for Alicante, where I had heard there was a Genoese vessel taking in a cargo of wood for Genoa. It is now some 22 years since I left my father's house, and all that time, though I have written several letters, I have had no news whatever of him or my brothers. My own adventures during that period I will now relate briefly. I embarked at Alicante, reached Genoa after a prosperous voyage, and proceeded thence to Milan, where I provided myself with arms and a few soldiers' accoutrements. Thence it was my intention to go and take service in Piedmont, but as I was already on the road to Alessandria della Paglia, I learned that the Duke of Alva was on his way to Flanders. I changed my plans, joined him, served under him in the campaigns he made, was present at the deaths of the Counts Egmont and Horn, and was promoted to be ensign under a famous captain of Guadalajara, Diego de Urbina by name. Some time after my arrival in Flanders, news came of the league that His Holiness Pope Pius V of happy memory had made with Venice and Spain against the common enemy, the Turk, who had just then with his fleet taken the famous island of Cyprus, which belonged to the Venetians, a loss deplorable and disastrous. It was known as a fact that the most serene Don John of Austria, natural brother of our good King Don Philip, was coming as commander-in-chief of the allied forces, and rumours were abroad of the vast warlike preparations which were being made. Oh, it stirred my heart and filled me with a longing to take part in the campaign which was expected. And though I had reason to believe, in almost certain promises, that on the first opportunity that presented itself I should be promoted to captain, I preferred to leave all and betake myself, as I did, to Italy, and it was my good fortune that Don John had arrived at Genoa, and was going to Naples to join the Venetian fleet, as he afterwards did at Messina. I say, in short, that I took part in that glorious expedition, promoted by this time to be a captain of infantry, to which honourable charge my good luck rather than my merits raised me. And that day, so fortunate for Christendom, because then all the nations of the earth were disabused of the error which they lay in imagining the Turks to be invincible on sea on that day, I say, on which the Ottoman pride and arrogance were broken, among all that were there made happy, for the Christians who died that day were happier than those who remained alive and victorious. I alone was miserable, for instead of some naval crown that I might have expected had it been in Roman times, or the night that followed that famous day, I found myself with fetters on my feet and manacles on my hands. It happened in this way. El-Ukali, the king of Algiers, a daring and successful corsair, having attacked and taken the leading Maltese galley, only 3 knights being left alive in it, and they badly wounded, the chief galley of John Andrea, on board of which I and my company were placed, came to its relief, and doing as was bound to do in such a case, I leaped on board the enemy's galley, which, sheering off from that which had attacked it, prevented my men from following me, and so I found myself alone in the midst of enemies who were in such numbers that I was unable to resist. In short, I was taken, covered with wounds. El-Ukali, as you know, sirs, made his escape with his entire squadron, and I was left a prisoner in his power, the only sad being among so many filled with joy, and the only captive among so many free. For there were 15,000 Christians, all at the oar in the Turkish fleet, that regained their longed for liberty that day. They carried me to Constantinople, where the Grand Turk made my master general at sea for having done his duty in battle, and carried off as evidence of his bravery the standard of the Order of Malta. The following year, which was the year 72, I found myself at Navarino, rowing in the leading galley with the 3 lanterns. There I saw and observed how the opportunity of capturing the whole Turkish fleet in harbour was lost, for all the marines and janissaries that belonged to it made sure that they were about to be attacked inside that very harbour, and had their kits and pasamaques or shoes ready to flee at once on shore without waiting to be assailed, and so great fear did they stand of our fleet. But heaven ordered it otherwise, not for any fault or neglect of the general who commanded on our side, but for the sins of Christendom, and because it was God's will and pleasure that we should always have instruments of punishment to chastise us. As it was, El-Ukali took refuge at Modon, which is an island near Navarino, and landing forces fortified the mouth of the harbour and waited quietly until Don John retired. On this expedition was taken the galley called the Prize, whose captain was the son of the famous corsair Barbarossa. It was taken by the chief Neapolitan galley called the She-Wolf, commanded by that thunderbolt of war, that father of his men, that successful and unconquered captain Don Alvaro de Bazan, Marquis of Santa Cruz, and I cannot help telling you what took place at the capture of the prize. The son of Barbarossa was so cruel and treated his slaves so badly that when those who were at the oars saw the She-Wolf galley was bearing down upon them and gaining upon them, they all at once dropped their oars and seized their captain, who stood on the stage at the end of the gangway, shouting to them to row lustily, and passing him on from bench to bench, from the poop to the prow, they so bit him that before he got much past the mast his soul had already gone to hell, so great, as I said, was the cruelty with which he treated them, and the hatred with which they hated him. We returned to Constantinople the following year, 73. It became known that Don John had seized Tunis and taken the kingdom for the Turks, and placed Muley Hamed in possession, putting an end to the hopes with which Muley Hamida, the cruelest and bravest Moor in the world, entertained of returning to reign there. The Grand Turk took the loss greatly to heart, and with cunning which all his race possessed, he made peace with the Venetians, who were much more eager for it than he was. And the following year, 74, he attacked Goletta and the fort which Don John had left half built near Tunis. While all these events were occurring, I was labouring at the oar without any hope of freedom. At least I had no hope of attaining it by ransom, for I was firmly resolved not to write to my father telling him of my misfortunes. At length the Goletta fell, and the fort fell, before which places there were 75,000 regular Turkish soldiers, and more than 4,000 Moors and Arabs from all parts of Africa, and in the train of all this great host such munitions and engines of war, and so many pioneers, that with their hands they might have covered the Goletta and the fort with handfuls of earth. The first to fall was the Goletta, until then reckoned impregnable, and it fell not by any fault of his defenders, who did all they could and should have done, but because experiment proved how easily entrenchments could be made in the desert sand there, for water used to be found at 2 palms depth, while the Turks found none at 2 yards, and so by means of a quantity of sandbags they raised their work so high that they commanded the walls of the fort, sweeping them as if from a cavalier, so that no one was able to make a stand or maintain the defence. It was a common opinion that our men should not have shut themselves up in the Goletta, but should have waited in the open at the landing place, but those who say so talk at random and with little knowledge of such matters. For if in the Goletta and in the fort there were barely 7,000 soldiers, how could such a small number, however resolute, sally out and hold their own against numbers like those of the enemy? And how is it possible to help losing a stronghold that is not relieved above all when surrounded by a host of determined enemies in their own country? But many thought, and I thought so too, that it was a special favour and mercy which Heaven showed to Spain in permitting the destruction of that source and hiding place of mischief, that devourer, sponge, and moth of countless money, fruitlessly wasted there to no other purpose save preserving the memory of its capture by the invincible Charles V, as if to make that eternal as it is and will be. These stones were needed to support it. The fort also fell, but the Turks had to win it inch by inch, for the soldiers who defended it fought so gallantly and stoutly that the number of the enemy killed in 22 general assaults exceeded 25,000. Of 300 that remained alive, not one was taken unwounded, a clear and manifest proof of their gallantry and resolution, and how sturdily they had defended themselves and held their post. A small fort or tower, which was in the middle of the lagoon under command of Don Juan Zanogura, a Valencian gentleman and a famous soldier, capitulated upon terms. They took prisoner Don Pedro Portocarrero, commander of the Goletta, who had done all in his power to defend his fortress, and took the loss of it so much to heart that he died of grief on the way to Constantinople, where they were carrying him a prisoner. They also took the commander of the fort, Gabriel Cerbilon by name, a Milanese gentleman, a great engineer, and a very brave soldier. In these 2 fortresses perished many persons of note, among whom was Pagano Doria, knight of the Order of St. John, a man of generous disposition, as was shown by his extreme liberality to his brother, the famous John Andrea Doria, and what made his death the more sad was that he was slain by some Arabs to whom, seeing that the fort was now lost, he entrusted himself, and who offered to conduct him in the guise of a Moor to Tabarca, a small fort or station on the coast held by the Genoese, employed by the coral fishery. These Arabs cut off his head and carried it to the commander of the Turkish fleet, who proved on them the truth of our Castilian proverb that, though the treason may please, the traitor is hated, for they say he ordered those who brought him the present to be hanged for not having brought him alive. Among the Christians who were taken in the fort was one named Don Pedro de Aguilar, a native of some place, I know not what, in Andalusia, who had been my ensign in the fort, a soldier of great repute and rare intelligence, who had in particular a special gift for what they call poetry. I say so because his fate brought him to my galley and to my bench, and made him a slave to the same master. Before we left the port, this gentleman composed 2 sonnets by way of epitaphs, one on the Goletta and the other on the fort. Indeed, I may as well repeat them, for I have them by heart, and I think they will be liked rather than disliked. The instant the captain mentioned the name of Don Pedro de Aguilar, Don Fernando looked at his companions, and they all 3 smiled, and when he came to speak of the sonnets, one of them said, "Before your worship proceeds any further, I entreat you to tell me what became of that Don Pedro de Aguilar you have spoken of." "All I know is," replied the captive, "that after having been in Constantinople 2 years, he escaped in the disguise of an Arno, in company with a Greek spy, but whether he regained his liberty or not I cannot tell, though I fancy he did, because a year afterwards I saw the Greek at Constantinople, though I was unable to ask him what the result of the journey was." "Well, then, you are right," returned the gentleman, "for that Don Pedro is my brother, and he is now in our village in good health, rich, married, and with 3 children. Thanks be to God for all the mercies he has shown him," said the captive, "for to my mind there is no happiness on earth to compare with recovering lost liberty. And what is more," said the gentleman, "I know the sonnets my brother made." "Let your worship repeat them," said the captive, "for you will recite them better than I can." "With all my heart," said the gentleman. "The Don the Goletta runs thus." End of chapter 39. Chapter 40. In which the story of the captive is continued. Sonnet. Blessed souls that, from this mortal husk set free, in guerdon of brave deeds beatified, above this lowly orb of ours abide, made heirs of heaven and immortality, with noble rage and ardour glowing ye, your strength, while strength was yours, in battle plied, and with your own blood in the foeman's died, the sandy soil and the encircling sea, It was the ebbing life-blood first that failed, the weary arms, the stout hearts never quailed. Though vanquished, yet ye earned the victor's crown, though mourned, yet still triumphant was your fall. For there ye won, between the sword and wall, in heaven glory, and on earth renown. That is exactly according to my recollection, said the captive. Well, that on the fort, said the gentleman, if my memory serves me, goes thus. Up from this wasted soil, this shattered shell, whose walls and towers here in ruin lie, 3,000 soldiers took wing on high. In the bright mansions of the blest to dwell, the onslaught of the foemen to repel. By might of arm all vainly did they try, and when at length was left but them to die, wearied and few the last offenders fell, all this same arid soil hath ever been a haunt of countless mournful memories, as well in our days as in days of yore. But never yet to heaven it sent, I ween, for it hard bosom purer souls than these, braver bodies on its surface bore. The sonnets were not disliked, and the captive was rejoiced at the tidings they gave him of his comrade. And continuing his tale, he went on to say, the goletta and the fort thus being in their hands, the Turks gave orders to dismantle the goletta, for the fort was reduced to such a state that there was nothing left to level. And to do the work more quickly and easily, they mined it in 3 places. But nowhere were they able to blow up the part which seemed to be the least strong, that is to say, the old walls, while all that remained standing of the new fortifications that the Freton had made came close to the ground with the greatest ease. Finally the fleet returned victorious and triumphant to Constantinople, and after a few months died my master El Ukali, otherwise Ukali Fartax, which means in Turkish the scabby renegade. For that he was, it is in the practice with Turks to name people from some defect or virtue they may possess. The reason being that there are among them only 4 surnames belonging to families tracing their descent from the Ottoman house, and the others, as I have said, take their names and surnames either from bodily blemishes or moral qualities. This scabby one rode at the oar as a slave of the great seigneurs for 14 years, and when over 34 years of age, in resentment at having been struck by a Turk while at the oar, turned renegade and renounced his faith in order to be able to revenge himself, and such was his valour that, without owing his advancements to the base ways and means by which the most favourites of the Grand Seigneur rise to power, he came to be the King of Algiers, and afterwards General on Sea, which is the 3rd place of trust in the realm. He was a Calabrian by birth, and a worthy man morally, and he treated his slaves with great humanity. He had 3,000 of them, and after his death they were divided, as he directed by his will, between the Grand Seigneur, who was heir of all who die and shares with the children of the deceased, and his renegades. I fell to the lot of a Venetian renegade, who, when a cabin boy on board a ship, had been taken by Ukali, and was so much beloved by him that he became one of the most favoured youths. He came to be the most cruel renegade I ever saw. His name was Hassan Ajah, and he grew very rich and became the King of Algiers. With him I went there from Constantinople, rather glad to be so near to Spain. Not that I intended to write anyone about my unhappy lot, but to try if fortune would be kinder to me in Algiers than in Constantinople, where I had attempted in 1,000 ways to escape without ever finding a favourable time or chance. But in Algiers I resolved to seek for other means of effecting the purpose I cherished so dearly, for the hope of obtaining my liberty never deserted me, and when in my plots and schemes and attempts the result did not answer my expectations, without giving way to despair, I immediately began to look out for or conjure up some new hope to support me, however faint or feeble it might be. In this way I lived on immured in a building or prison called by the Turks a bano, in which they confine Christian captives, as well as those that are the king's as those belonging to private individuals, and also what they call those of the Almation, which is as much as to say the slaves of the municipality who serve the city in the public works and other employments. But captives of this kind recover their liberty with great difficulty, for as they are public property and have no particular master, there is no one with whom to treat for their ransom, even though they may have the means. To these banos, as I have said, some private individuals of the town are in the habit of bringing their captives, especially when they are to be ransomed, because there they can keep them in safety and comfort until their ransom arrives. The king's captives also that are on ransom do not go out to work with the rest of the crew, unless when their ransom is delayed, for then, to make them right for it more pressingly, they compel them to go and work for wood, which is no light labour. I, however, was one of those on ransom, for when it was discovered that I was captain, although I declared my scanty means and want of fortune, nothing could dissuade them from including me among the gentlemen and those wanting to be ransomed. They put a chain on me more as a mark of this than to keep me safe, so I passed my life in that baino with several other gentlemen and persons of quality, marked out as held to be ransomed. But though at times, or rather almost always, we suffered from hunger and scanty clothing, nothing distressed us so much hearing and seeing at every turn the unexampled and unheard of cruelty my master inflicted upon the Christians. Every day he hanged a man, impaled one, cut off the ears of another, all with so little provocation, or so entirely without any, that the Turks acknowledged he did it merely for the sake of doing it, and because he was by nature murderously disposed toward the whole human race. The only one that fared at all well with him was a Spanish soldier, something de Saavedra by name, to whom he never gave a blow himself, or ordered a blow to be given, or addressed a hard word, although he had done things that will dwell in the memory of the people there for many a year, and all to recover his liberty. And for the least of the many things he did, we all dreaded he would be impaled, and he himself was in fear of it more than once. And only that time does not allow, I could tell you now something of what that soldier did, that would interest and astonish you more than the narration of my own tale. To go on with my story, the courtyard of our prisons was overlooked by the windows of the house belonging to a wealthy Moor of high position, and these, as is usual in Moorish houses, were rather loopholes than windows, and besides were covered with thick and close lattice work. It so happened then, as I was one day on the terrace of our prison, with 3 other comrades, trying to pass away the time, how far we could leap with our chains, we being alone, for all the other Christians had gone to work, I chanced to raise my eyes, and from one of these little closed windows I saw a reed appear with a cloth attached to one end of it, and it kept waving to and fro, and moving as if making signs to us to come and take it. We watched it, and one of those who were with me went and stood under the reed to see whether they would let it drop, or what they would do, but as he did so the reed was raised and moved from side to side as if they meant to say no, by a shake of the head. The Christian came back, and it was again lowered, making the same movement as before. Another of my comrades went, and with him the same happened as with the first, and then the third went forward, but with the same result as the first and second. Seeing this, I did not like to try my luck, and as soon as I came under the reed, it was dropped and fell inside the baino at my feet. I hastened to untie the cloth, in which I perceived a knot, and in this were 10 cianis, which are the coins of base gold, current among the Moors, and each worth 10 reals of our money. It is needless to say that I rejoiced at this godsend, and my joy was not less than my wonder, as I strove to imagine how this good fortune could have come to us. But to me especially, for the evident unwillingness to drop the reed for any but me showed that it was for me the favour was intended. I took my welcome money, broke the reed, and returned to the terrace, and looking up at the window I saw a very white hand put out that opened and shut very quickly. From this we gathered or fancied that it must be some woman living in the house that had done us this kindness, and to show that we were grateful it, we made salams after the fashion of the Moors, bowing the head and bending the body, and crossing the arms on the breast. Shortly afterwards, at the same window, a small cross made of reeds was put out and immediately withdrawn. The sign led us to believe that some Christian woman was a captive in the house, and that it was she who had been so good to us, but the whiteness of the hand and the bracelets we had perceived made us dismiss that idea, though we thought it might be one of the Christian renegades whom their masters very often take as lawful wives, and gladly, for they prefer them to the women of their own nation. And all our conjectures were wide of the truth. So from that time forward our sole occupation was watching and gazing at the window where the cross had appeared to us, as if it were our pole star. But at least 15 days passed without our seeing either it or the hand, or any sign, and though meanwhile we endeavoured with the whole utmost pains to ascertain who it was that lived in the house, and whether there were any Christian renegade in it, nobody could tell ever us anything more than that he who lived there was a rich Moor of high position, had Murato by name, formerly alcaide of La Plata, an office of dignity high among them. But when we least thought it was going to rain any more cianis from that corner, we saw the reed suddenly appear with another cloth tied in a larger knot attached to it, and this at a time when on a former occasion the baino was deserted and unoccupied. We made a trial as before, each of the same 3 going forward before I did, but the reed was delivered to none but me, and on my approach it was let to drop. I untied the knot, and I found 40 Spanish gold crowns with a paper written in Arabic, and at the end of the writing there was a large cross drawn. I kissed the cross, took the crowns, and returned to the terrace, and we all made our salams. Again the hand appeared. I made signs that I would read the paper, and then the window was closed. We were all puzzled, though filled with joy at what had taken place, and as none of us understood Arabic, great our curiosity was to know what the paper continued, and still greater the difficulty of finding someone to read it. At last I resolved to confide in a renegade, a native of Murcia, who professed a very great friendship for me, and had given pledges that bound him to keep any secret I might entrust to him. For it is the custom with some renegades, when they intend to return to Christian territory, to carry about them certificates from captives of mark testifying in whatever form they can that such and such a renegade is a worthy man who has always shown kindness to Christians, and is anxious to escape on the first opportunity that may present itself. Some obtain these testimonials with good intentions, others put them to a cunning use, so when they go to pillage on Christian territory, if they chance to be cast away, or taken prisoners, they produce their certificates and say that from these papers may be seen the object they came for, which was to remain on Christian ground, that it was to this end they joined the Turks in their foray. In this way they escape the consequences of the first outburst and make their peace with the church before it does them any harm. And when they have the chance, they return to Barbary to become what they were before. Others, however, who procure these papers and make use of them honestly, and remain on Christian soil. This friend of mine, then, was one of these renegades that I have described. He had certificates from all our comrades, in which we testified in his favour as strongly as we could, and if the Moors had found the papers, they would have had him burned alive. I knew that he understood Arabic very well, and could not only speak, but also write it, but before I disclosed the whole matter to him, I asked him to read for me this paper, which I had found by accident in a hole in my cell. He opened it, and remained some time examining it, and muttering to himself as he translated it. I asked him if he understood it, and he told me he did perfectly well, and that if I wished him to tell him its meaning, word for word, I must give him a pen and ink, that he might do it more satisfactorily. We at once gave him what he required, and he set about translating it, bit by bit, and when he had done, he said, "All that is here in Spanish is what the Moorish paper contains, and you must bear in mind that when it says Layla Marian, it means Our Lady the Virgin Mary." We read the paper, and it ran thus: "When I was a child, my father had a slave who taught me to pray the Christian prayer in my own language, and told me many things about Layla Marian. The Christian died, and I know that she did not go to the fire, but to Allah, because since then I have seen her twice, and she told me to go to the land of the Christians to see Layla Marian, who had great love for me. I know not how to go. I have seen many Christians, but except thyself none has seemed to be to me a gentleman. I am young and beautiful, and have plenty of money to take with me. See if thou canst contrive how we may go, and if thou wilt, thou shalt be my husband there, and if thou wilt not, it will not distress me, for Layla Marian will find me someone to marry me. I myself have written this. Have a care to whom thou givest it to read. Trust no more, for they are all perfidious. I am greatly troubled on this account, for I would not have thee confide in anyone, because if my father knew it, he would at once fling me down a wall, and cover me with stones. I will put a thread to the reed, tie the answer to it, and if thou hast no one to write for thee in Arabic, tell it to me by signs, for Layla Marian will make me understand thee. She and Allah, and this cross, which I often kiss, as the captive bade me, protect thee." Judge, sirs, whether we had reason for surprise and joy at the words of this paper, and both one and the other were so great that the renegade perceived that the paper had not been found by chance, but had been in reality addressed to some one of us, and he begged us, if that what he suspected were the truth, to trust him and tell him all, for he would risk his life for our freedom, and so saying, he took out from his breast a metal crucifix, and with many tears swore by God, the image represented, in whom, sinful and wicked as he was, he truthfully and faithfully believed, to be loyal to us, and keep secret whatever we chose to reveal to him, for he thought, and almost foresaw, that by means of her who had written that paper, he and all of us would obtain our liberty, and he himself obtained the object he so much desired, his restoration to the bosom of the Holy Mother Church, from which, by his own sin and ignorance, he was now severed like a corrupt limb. And the renegade said this with so many tears and such signs of repentance, that, with one consent, we all agreed to tell him the whole truth of the matter, and so we gave him a full account of all, without hiding anything from him. We pointed out to him the window at which the reed appeared, and he by that means took note of the house, and resolved to ascertain with particular care who lived in it. We agreed also that it would be advisable to answer the Moorish lady's letter, and the renegade, without a moment's delay, took down the words I dictated to him, which were exactly what I tell you, for nothing of importance that took place in this affair has escaped my memory, or ever will, while life lasts. This, then, was the answer returned to the Moorish lady: "The true Allah protect thee, lady, and that blessed Mary, who is the true mother of God, and who has put it into thy heart to go into the land of the Christians, because she loves thee. Entreat her that she be pleased to show thee how thou canst execute the commands she gives thee, for she will, such is her goodness. On my own part, and on that of all these Christians who are with me, I promise to do all that we can for thee, even to death. Fail not to write me and inform me of what thou dost mean to do, and I will always answer thee, For the great Allah has given us a Christian captive, who can speak and write thy language well. As thou mayest see by this paper, without fear, therefore, thou canst inform us of all thou wouldst. As to what thou sayest, that if thou dost reach the land of the Christians, thou wilt be my wife, I give thee my promise upon it as a good Christian, and know that the Christians keep their promises better than the Moors. Allah and Mary and his mother watch over thee, my lady. The paper being written and folded, I waited 2 days until the bano was empty as before, and immediately repaired to the usual walk of the terrace to see if there were any sign of the reed, which was not long in making its appearance. As soon as I saw it, although I could not distinguish who put it out, I showed the paper as a sign to attach the thread, but it was already fixed to the reed, and to it I tied the paper. And shortly afterwards our star once more made its appearance with the white flag of peace, the little bundle. It was dropped, and I picked it up, and found in cloth and gold and silver coins of all sorts more than 50 crowns, which 50 times more strengthened our joy and doubled our hope of gaining our liberty. That very night our renegade returned and said he had learned that the Moor, who had been told that we lived in that house, that his name was Haji Murato, that he was enormously rich, and that he had only one daughter, the heiress of all his wealth, and that it was the general opinion throughout the city that she was the most beautiful woman in Barbary, and that several of the viceroys who came there had sought her for a wife, but that she had always been unwilling to marry, and he had learned, moreover, that she had had a Christian slave who was now dead, all which agreed with the contents of the paper. We immediately took counsel with the renegade as to what means would have to be adopted in order to carry off the Moorish lady and bring us all to Christian territory. And in the end it was agreed that for the present we should wait for a second communication from Zoraida, for that was the name of her who now desires to be called Maria, because we saw clearly that she and no one else could find a way out of all these difficulties. When we had decided upon this, the renegade told us not to be uneasy, for he would lose his life or restore us to liberty. For 4 days the bano was filled with people, for which reason the reed delayed its appearance for 4 days. But at the end of that time, when the bano was, as it generally was, empty, it appeared with a cloth so bulky that it promised a happy birth. Reed and cloth came down to me, and I found another paper and 100 crowns in gold, without any other coin. The renegade was present, and in our cell we gave him the paper, and read, which was to this effect: I cannot think of a plan, Señor, for our going to Spain, nor has Lela Marien shown me one, though I have asked her. All that can be done is for me to give you plenty of money in gold from this window. With it ransom yourself and your friends, and let one of you go to the land of the Christians, and there buy a vessel and come back for the others. And he will find me in my father's garden, which is at the Babazon gate near the seashore, where I shall be all this summer with my father and my servants. You can carry me away from there by night without any danger, and bring me to the vessel. And remember thou art to be my husband, else I will pray to Marian and punish thee. If thou canst not trust any one to go for the vessel, ransom thyself, and do thou go, for I know thou wilt return more surely than any other, as thou art a gentleman and a Christian. Endeavour to make thyself acquainted with the garden, and when I see thee walking yonder, I shall know that the bano is empty, and I will give thee abundance of money. Allah protect thee, Señor. These were the words and contents of the second paper, and on hearing them, each declared himself willing to be the ransomed one, and promised to go in return with a scrupulous good faith. And I too made the same offer, but all this the renegade objected, saying that he would not on any account consent to one of us being set free before all went together. His experience had taught him how ill those who have been set free keep their promises, which they made in captivity, for captives of distinction frequently had recourse to this plan, paying the ransom of one who was to go back to Valencia or Majorca with money to enable him to arm a bank in return for the others who had ransomed him, but who never came back, for recovered liberty and the dread of losing it again effaced from the memory all the obligations in the world. And to prove the truth of what he said, he told us briefly of what had happened to a certain Christian gentleman, almost at that very time, the strangest case that had ever occurred even there, where astonishing and marvellous things are happening every instant. In short, he ended by saying that what he could and ought to be done was to give the money intended for the ransom of one of us Christians to him, so that he might with it buy a vessel there in Algiers under the pretence of becoming a merchant and trader to Tunis and along the coast, and when the master of the vessel it would be easy for him to hit on some way of getting us all out of the bano and putting us on board, especially if the Moorish lady gave, as she said, money enough to ransom all, because once free it would be the easiest thing in the world for us to embark, even in open day. But the greatest difficulty was that the Moors do not allow any renegade to buy or own any craft unless it be a large vessel for going on roving expeditions, because they are afraid that anyone who buys a small vessel, especially if he a Spaniard, wants it only for the purpose of escaping to Christian territory. This he could get over by arranging with a Taggart and Moor to go shares with him in the purchase of the vessel, and in the profit on the cargo, and under cover of this he could become the master of the vessel in which he looked upon all the rest as accomplished. But though to me and my comrades it had seemed a better plan to send one to Majorca for the vessel, as the Moorish lady suggested, we did not dare to oppose him, fearing that if we did not go, as he said, he would denounce us and place us in danger of losing all our lives if he were to disclose our dealings with Zoraida, for whose life he would have given all our own. We therefore resolved to put ourselves in the hands of God and in the renegades, and at the same time an answer was given to Zoraida, telling her we would do all she recommended, for she had given us good advice as if Lela Marian had delivered it, and that it depended on her alone whether we were to defer the business or to put it into execution at once. I renewed my promise to be her husband, and thus the next day that the bano chanced to be empty, she at different times gave us by means the reed and cloth 2,000 gold crowns and a paper in which she said that the next Juna, that is to say Friday, she was going to her father's garden, but that before she went she would give us more money, and if it were not enough we were to let her know, and she would come and give us as much as we asked for her father had so much he would not miss it, and besides he kept all the keys. We at once gave the renegade 500 crowns to buy the vessel, and with 800 I ransomed myself, giving the money to a Valencian merchant who happened to be in Algiers at the time, and who had released me on his word, pledging it that on the arrival of the first ship from Valencia he would pay my ransom. For if he had given the money at once, it would have made the king suspect that my ransom money had been for a long time in Algiers, and that the merchant had for his own advantage kept it secret. In fact, my master was so difficult to deal with that I dared not on any account pay down the money at once. The Thursday before the Friday on which the fair Zoraida was to go to the garden, she gave us 1,000 crowns more, and warned us of her departure, begging me, if I were ransomed, to find her at her father's garden at once, and by all means seek an opportunity of going there to see her. I answered in a few words that I would do so, and that you must remember to commend us to Lela Marian with all the prayers the captive had taught her. This having been done, steps were taken to ransom our 3 comrades, so as to enable them to quit the bano, unless seeing me ransom and themselves not, though the money was forthcoming, they should make a disturbance about it, and the devil should prompt them to do something that might injure Zoraida. For their proposition might be sufficient to relieve me from this apprehension. Nevertheless, I was unwilling to run any risk in the matter, and so I had them ransomed in the same way as I was, handing over all the money to the merchant, so that he might with safety and confidence give security, without, however, confiding our arrangement in secret to him, which might have been dangerous. End of chapter 40.